welcome to you all again from all parts of the world, and we can start now with the very first speaker. We welcome either Kate from Australia, University of Griffith. Heather is working on the functioning of terrestrial ecosystems and particularly on forest dynamics. She has a strong background on studying primary forest and on their carbon accounting on the forest. So we are very much looking forward to she's experience and her expertise in modeling carbon stocks in natural forest and their contribution to mitigating the climatic change. So please, Heather, you can open your start opening your presentation. Good morning.
Hello, Alfredo. I think my screen is shared now.
Yes.
And I'll put that into slideshow.
Yes.
There. Has that come through?
Yes. Yes.
We can see thank perfectly.
You. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alfredo and the University of Tuscia for the opportunity to tell you about our work on an international project about the protection of primary forests. This project is led by Professor Brendan Mackey at Griffith University in Australia, and together with collaborators, and you can see there are many collaborators around the world, we work on a number of case studies in many regions. This is an applied multidisciplinary research project to advance the protection of the world's remaining tropical, temperate and boreal primary forests through firstly improving the information base, and especially the work that I'm involved with is ecosystem carbon stocks and flows, then to identify emerging and realised threats to these ecosystems, developing business case methods and analysis for sustainability of primary forest conservation projects, case study investigations and on-ground implementation, and developing forest-related international policy options for implementation in the Paris Agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the SDGs. Identifying and mapping primary forests in Europe and then assessing their carbon stocks from available site data is a key part of the case study work. So an outline of what I'll talk to you about today is firstly the role of primary forests and global climate regulation, carbon stocks in primary forests in Europe, the ecosystem services derived from forests, and I'll use an example from Australia, and informing management for conservation and restoration. So the importance of primary forests. We define a primary forest as naturally regenerated forests of native tree species whose composition, structure and function are dominated by ecological and evolutionary processes, including natural disturbance regimes. Primary forest is a broad term which encompasses many related terms such as stable, intact, old growth, frontier, long untouched, primeval, and virgin forest. These primary forests include mixed ages as a mosaic of patches of different cirral stages and mixed aged stands at different stages of development under gap phase dynamics that result from different frequencies and severities of natural disturbance regimes. Forest categories are differentiated based on characteristics of their ecological condition in terms of their composition, structure and function. Characteristics include mixed-aged stands and different seral stages, high carbon stocks and high biodiversity, and their stability, resilience and adaptive capacity. The role of primary forests in conservation and restoration is to provide a reference level for restoration potential as a source of genetic diversity to enable regeneration and adaptation, to provide a range of ecosystem services, and they represent nodes from which to radiate restoration activities, and as a reservoir for the safe storage of carbon stocks. Information about the carbon cycle is needed to inform policy questions about the ecosystem service of global climate regulation. Climate regulation depends on both the magnitude and the longevity of the carbon stocks in the biosphere and the consequent stock in the atmosphere. Information is needed about carbon stocks and flows, their relation to ecosystem condition, stock changes as additions and reductions, and drivers of this change, and about deriving a consistent reference level of carbon stocks. So we can see as you add more trees, you take away some of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So our objectives for carbon modelling work in primary forests is firstly to quantify a realistic estimate of total carbon storage in primary forests, and using this to improve parameterisation of carbon accounting guidelines and global biomass models to reflect the magnitude of carbon stocks in primary forests. And then secondly, to define the carbon carrying capacity of European temperate forests, and using this as a reference level from which to calculate the carbon sequestration potential of restoration activities. Then thirdly, determining the ecosystem service for global climate regulation derived from protecting the carbon stocks in primary forests. And fourth, demonstrating the significance of carbon storage in primary forests for climate mitigation. So to define carbon carrying capacity and its relationship with current carbon stock, this graph shows the carbon stock density as along the x-axis and the theoretical distribution as the proportion of the area across a landscape at these different carbon stock densities. The distribution of carbon stock density represents the mosaic of age classes and environmental conditions across the landscape. The area under these two curves remains the same, but the range in their carbon stock densities increases as forests continue growing and accumulating carbon. So as seen in the aerial images across the bottom of a forest landscape with a mosaic of patches of different ages of stands, and then as they continue to grow without further disturbance, they continue to grow over time and increase in age and increase in their carbon stock. So the change is from the current carbon stock, which represents the current age distribution of secondary forest managed for commodity production under combined human and natural disturbance regimes, and a change to the carbon carrying capacity, which represents the age distribution of primary forests managed for conservation under prevailing environmental conditions and natural disturbance regimes. And so the change from the current carbon stock to the carrying capacity is the carbon restoration potential, and this represents the gain in carbon stock when the secondary forests are managed for regeneration and restoration to allow continued growth and increase in their age classes. So in this project, we are aiming to estimate this carbon carrying capacity as the carbon stocks in primary forests. This map shows the primary forest sites where we have been able to have data shared from a whole range of researchers and National Forest Inventory people across Europe. And we're very grateful for the generosity of these people in sharing their data and contributing to the project. The green shaded area is the current forest cover based on the global map from Hansen and using a greater than 25% canopy cover for temperate forests. So these sites were selected to represent primary forest characteristics. The locations are not necessarily representative of the whole forest type, because remaining patches of primary forest mostly occur on extreme sites such as steep slopes and high elevation that are likely to be at the lower end of the productivity gradient for that forest type. Factors influencing the stand age in primary forests are complex and involve the frequency and severity of disturbance events, and this will determine what the age distribution of the trees occurs across the landscape. The distribution of these primary forest sites is shown here related to the potential natural vegetation across Europe based on the classification of vegetation form by Bonn. And there are four main forest types that I've listed there in the legend beside the map. The sites we have so far in our study are clustered in two main forest types and occur particularly in spruce and beech forests. This reflects both where primary forests still remain, but also where there are research sites and people whom we've been able to contact and have shared their data. Therefore, these sites are not necessarily representative of all remaining primary forests. And we would be very pleased to have further contributions of site data in other forest types, and particularly in Western Europe, if there are other people who would be interested in collaborating on this project to do with protection of primary forests. This graph is a summary of the carbon stocks that have been calculated at the sites and averaged by the country and forest type. It shows the above and below ground living biomass and dead biomass, which consists of dead standing trees and coarse woody debris. The soil carbon is estimated from a global map of modelled soil organic carbon in the top 30 centimetres of the soil. The red bar on the right shows the IPCC default value for the carbon stock in above ground biomass. And this table shows a little more detail about the IPCC values. So at the top are the values, average values for the site data. And this shows the total above ground biomass as an average across all the sites with beech forest as 215 tonnes of carbon per hectare, and for conifer forests 156 tonnes of carbon per hectare. And then the table below is the IPCC default values for forest biomass that are used in the guidelines for the national greenhouse gas inventories. So these guidelines were reported in 2006 and then refined in 2019. Values are reported for, well, the ones I have shown here are the ecological zones within Europe, but data are not available for all the zones and the age categories. So our main messages from this comparison is that continued collection of site data is important to continually improve these estimates as default values that will be used in national greenhouse gas inventories. That primary forest and secondary forest need to have separate estimates of biomass. They are very different. Some forest types are not adequately represented in these current values for ecological zones. For example, particularly the high biomass in beech forests. Dead biomass, below ground biomass and soil carbon should also be included in the tables of default values, which currently now just have above ground living biomass. But these other components are important as well. And so identification and measurement of primary forests is critical to define the carbon restoration potential of forests and their climate change mitigation benefit. This map shows the global modelled biomass called GloBiomass, and it shows the spatial distribution of above ground living biomass. This modelled biomass uses calibration from the existing forests that represent age classes resulting from both human and natural disturbances. So many of these are secondary forests, and it represents the current carbon stocks. We can see clearly here the higher biomass in forests in the Carpathian and Dinaric mountains, where we have many of our site data. Now, using this global map and comparing it with our site data, this graph shows the distribution of carbon stock densities across all of the sites in Europe, and they're shown in the dark blue histograms. And it's compared with the global biomass maps. Now, there are two variations of this map, geocarbon and GloBiomass, that use different estimations of biomass and spatial coverage. And we can see here that the biomass from the site data is higher than the global mapped biomass by factors of 1.7 and 2.2. And this illustrates the higher carbon stocks in primary forests than the current carbon stock in existing forests. This is the same format of the graph, but the sites are separated out for broadleaf species and conifer species. So the difference between the site data and the global maps is much greater for the broadleaf species. Now I've been concentrating on carbon, but I'm going to turn now to a range of ecosystem services and use an example from a study of mine in Australia. So these photos are to give you an idea of the type of forest. It's a wet temperate eucalypt forest in southeast Australia, the red square down in the south in the state of Victoria. And here, our study quantifying ecosystem services has been used to help inform policies about forest management in this region. The region has conflicting land uses, particularly the provision of native timber, water supply catchments. We can see the reservoir in the lower photo, storage of carbon in very large trees, conservation of endangered wildlife and ecosystems, and the area is used for recreation. So we use the system of environmental economic accounting as a framework for reporting information on the various ecosystem assets and services. Ecosystem accounting compiles information across the landscape, so it's done spatially, and integrates assets and services for the region. It translates environmental values into economic terms, allows quantitative comparisons but within a common framework of reporting the data, and allows evaluation of trade-offs, both quantitative and spatially across the landscape. So our region consists of native forests in the mountains, small areas of plantations, agriculture and grazing, water supply catchments to supply the city, and environments used for culture, education, and recreation. I'll first look specifically at the ecosystem service related to carbon in these forests and their role in climate mitigation. The way accounting for carbon stocks and flows is performed and how the ecosystem service is defined have significant impact on the policy signals delivered from the scientific data. I will explain why assessing carbon stocks delivers the right policy signals. So the carbon retention value is based on the stock of carbon stored in an ecosystem, and this recognises that the retained carbon represents a value as avoided damages due to stock loss. In contrast, the carbon sequestration value is based on the net annual carbon flow that represents net removal from the atmosphere and uptake by ecosystems. This graph shows results from our Australian forest region, where the green curve is the primary forest managed for protection, and the orange curve is the secondary forest managed for commodity production. The carbon stocks in this primary forest represent the carbon carrying capacity that is needed to assess the reference level for restoration potential. Carbon retention as the accumulated storage of carbon in the ecosystem shows a long-term increase in the primary forest, but a decrease in the secondary forest over time. Carbon sequestration shows annual fluctuations in carbon flows that are related to growth rates and emissions due to disturbance, in our case, wildfires and logging, and then increased rates of growth after regeneration. The most appropriate policy signal for climate mitigation is the long-term storage of carbon in ecosystems that is assessed as the service of carbon retention. This figure summarises the value of ecosystem services in the forest region as the industry contribution to the economy. The left-hand stacked column graph represents the current situation where the ecosystem services provide a total value of 973 million Australian dollars per annum. Trade-offs in the use of ecosystem services were analysed in the counterfactual case. So that is the difference in the industry value added of ecosystem services if native forest harvesting had not occurred in this region over our time period of 1990 to 2015. And we used 3 scenarios related to the gains in value that would occur in the other ecosystem services. These estimates of gain in value are represented as the coloured circles, and these vary depending on known or potential gains and either high or low estimates. Under any of these 3 scenarios, the gains in ecosystem services of water supply, tourism, and carbon sequestration are greater than the loss of revenue from timber harvesting. In addition, there are the services provided by biodiversity, even if the monetary value is undefined. In this region, there are several critically endangered species. For example, a possum that lives in the tall trees. Without setting a price on the endangered species, one can assess their value based on the scenario of reducing their threat of extinction by foregoing the $12 million value of the harvested timber, which would allow improvement in the ecosystem condition for their habitat. In this way, the ecosystem accounts reveal the trade-offs in the use of ecosystem services and their relative benefits. Now, the data are collected and reported spatially, and so we can represent it. The squares represent our study region, and we can display the data as the spatial distribution of the value of ecosystem services. And it's shown here as indices for the water yield, the carbon stock density, and the native timber provisioning. Combining the indices for the 3 ecosystem services produced an interaction index that shows the hotspots of highest values for all ecosystem services. So that's shown the highest values are in red. And this is where trade-offs are required between land uses that are conflicting, such as the timber harvesting and the water or carbon. And the areas that are conflicting, where timber harvesting is actually occurring in water catchments and in forests with very high carbon densities, the main areas are shown here by the purple rings. This spatial assessment could also be used to identify areas that maximise provision of complementary ecosystem services and so have the greatest potential for restoration. So in summary, I'll conclude with some major points about what evidence there is from ecosystem accounts to inform environmental management for conservation and restoration. So carbon stocks in primary forests represent the carbon carrying capacity of the ecosystem as a reference level for assessing restoration potential. Ecosystem accounts report the change in condition of ecosystem assets and services over time, and thus provide the capability to track progress towards targets, such as greenhouse gas emission reduction targets or biodiversity conservation targets. Spatial distributions can be identified of high conflict between land uses or high potential for restoration of multiple ecosystem services. The accounts quantify relative values and potential gains and losses involved with impacts and trade-offs between land uses. So our example from the Australian forest showed the trade-off between timber harvesting, which actually produced a lower revenue than the gains that could be gained from increased water supply and carbon storage. And lastly, the accounts allow judgments about relative values of conservation of biodiversity and habitats without necessarily having a monetary value, if you can assess it as the foregone loss of the value of one ecosystem service, such as timber harvesting, in order to increase the ecosystem condition for other ecosystem services. Right. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Heather, for your very interesting presentation of these key topics. These are very much, it's really a frontier in the research in forest science and environmental science to try to quantifying the value of all these benefits that we get from nature, even if we know that nature has no value, is invaluable per se, but it's very important to start quantifying all the goods and the value that are intrinsic in these many aspects of ecosystems that we rely on for our life. So thanks a lot, and we already have some questions. One question for you from Tamrat is, how could you take representative forest sample to estimate carbon stock of natural forests?
Yes, because I did stress that the sites that we are currently using for primary forests in Europe are not necessarily representative. If we were to design an inventory survey, it would require detailed stratification of the environmental conditions and forest types, and then random location of sites within those primary forest patches. Ideally, that would be the way to sample them, but at this stage, we're having to rely on existing sites and data. Within a small region, that would be possible. So the region that I used as an illustration from Australia, that is what we did. We selected those sites to be stratified, representative, and then randomly located.
Okay, thanks. we have also another question from Yannick. In one of your first slides, you mentioned that management for regeneration increases the carbon storage potential of secondary forests. What exactly do you mean by management for regeneration in secondary forests?
Allowing the secondary forests to continue growing without harvesting them. So management for conservation and allowing those forests to continue their natural growth cycle.
Okay. Another question from Josie from Slovenia. The protection function of forests as a reduction of threats to natural hazards is not part of your study?
So natural threats.
The reduction in natural threats.
So perhaps that means like natural disturbance events like insect attacks, storms, wildfires. Our definition
also
of
maybe erosion, natural hazards, avalanches.
Yes. So those natural threats or disturbance events would occur within our definition of primary forest. And in some cases, we and other people have shown that a primary forest has greater resilience to those threats. So that has been shown for our eucalypt forests in Australia, that they're more resilient to wildfires when you have older ages, moister forests, compared with a secondary forest that has been harvested and is even aged. So I think there are some examples of increased resilience in primary forests, but there's a lot more work that needs to go on to research a greater range of those threats and the response of different forest types, I think.
Okay, another question is a great presentation, the compliments for you. And how did you solve the selection of primary forest based on their age difference? A question from Ola Maidayo. It's on the selection of primary forest.
Yes, if it's a selection of primary forests at the sites in Europe, some of the sites had detailed dendrochronological data. So for example, Alfredo's sites in Italy, sites from the Czech University of Life Sciences through the Carpathian Mountains. And from their tree ring data, they can identify the sequence of past disturbance events and the age patterns, and I think and relate that to the structure of the primary forest. And I think that's a very robust way of defining that that the structure of those forests is caused by natural disturbance events. Other sites have relied more on historical information about their age or past history, and so are not as detailed. We don't necessarily have to know the exact age of the trees, but the more important characteristics are to do with their structure and the fact that there's dead biomass, there's a range of ages, and that there are some old trees.
Okay, there is another one from Ahmad in Indonesia. Have you considered or measured the leakage of carbon on carbon scenarios forest management? The leakage of carbon on carbon scenarios and forest management.
So I'm wondering if that means leakage in terms of if you protect a forest in one area to increase its carbon stock, that there will be greater harvesting that is often what is termed leakage. There will be increased harvesting of forests in another region. And that's absolutely critical, and it's one of the main components that needs to be assessed in the National Greenhouse Gas reporting to the UNFCCC. So that requires not just site or region-based carbon accounting, but at much larger national and international scales to ensure that that leakage from one region to another is not occurring.
Okay. Another question is, eucalyptus is known for its negative environmental impact, and your results show the reverse, if I understand well. The gain from ecosystem service is timber production. Could you explain this a little bit more, please, Asabane?
I'm not quite, which country does this person come from?
I don't know. Asabene is the name. What's your country? I don't know.
I think the species of tree and the ecosystem services that forest
Ethiopia.
would provide and whether it's considered environmentally beneficial or not, it depends entirely on where that species occurs and whether it's native of that area. So the results I showed were for eucalypts in Australia. So that it's our native species. They're our natural forests. In fact, the forests that I showed, there are patches of primary forest that have had really very little human interference and no harvesting. And they have the highest value of ecosystem services. Whereas eucalypts that are planted in other countries, probably in Ethiopia, certainly in Mediterranean countries and in South America and in Southeast Asia, eucalypts are planted in these other countries as plantations, as monocultures. And yes, they're exotic species. They are not they may grow well and they may produce good products, but they're not appropriate for that environment. And I agree that they're not. They don't have a positive environmental services. So it depends entirely on where the species occurs and whether it's native or not.
So just a last question from Citi. Can we categorize the primary and secondary forest from its carbon stocks?
I don't think so. I think that the terms primary and secondary refer to the way the forests have been managed and the degree of human impact on those forests. So within a forest type and within the envelope of environmental conditions, a primary forest would have higher carbon stocks than a secondary forest, but you could not compare the carbon stocks across different types. So I would use structural characteristics to differentiate primary and secondary.
So thanks really very much, Heather, for your contribution and for replying to all these sentences. And so that's okay. I guess we can switch to the next talk. So thanks again, Heather, and you can stay with us if you have time. It's already night there, so thanks for staying with us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Alfredo.
So I welcome now the next speakers, Giovanni Giuseppe Vendramin and Andrea Piotti. They are geneticists from the Institute of Bioscience and Bioresources of the National Research Council in Italy. And Giovanni Giuseppe Vendramin is director of this institute in the National Research Council in Italy. And it's mainly interested in population and conservation genetics and genomics of forestries. And then Andrea is a researcher in the same institute. Andrea Piotti is a population geneticist, and it's mainly interested in gene flow and dispersal in plants and conservation genetics of Mediterranean forests. So we really welcome they here with us, as they are very expert in the topics of tree conservation and tree genetics, especially with attention on forest dynamics. So welcome, Giovanni, Giuseppe, and Andrea, and the floor is yours.
Can you hear me, Alfredo?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you very much, Alfredo, for the introduction. And of course, I would like to express all my gratitude to the organizers for the invitation. So this presentation, which is shared with my friend and colleague, Andrea Piotti, is organized according to some keywords. The first keyword is climatic changes. It is well known that forests are facing climatic changes in terms of increasing temperature, modification of the precipitation regimes, and an increased frequency of extreme events. The increasing temperature, modification of the precipitation regimes, and increased extreme and the frequency of extreme events are expected to have a strong impact on the distribution of the different tree species in Europe. As you can see here from these slides, where I'm showing an example of the distribution, the expected distribution of oak species in Europe. The second keyword is the Mediterranean ecosystem, not only because it's one of the most vulnerable in relation to the climatic changes, but also because the Mediterranean basin is a hotspot of biodiversity with over 11,000 endemic plants, 52 putative refugia, and 10 regional hotspots of plant biodiversity. In addition, in the Mediterranean basin, there are 7 pine species with contrasting habitats and demographical history, which makes the comparison across the different pine species particularly interesting. Of course, the Mediterranean population are generally characterized by a very high level of fragmentation, and often they display a very small population size. On the other side, Mediterranean population of forested species have normally very large amount of genetic variation, which is mainly due to the survival in the southern part of Europe of the several species in glacial refugia, and large level of gene flow at mesoscale distances. What can trees do to cope with the climatic changes? Basically, they have 3 possibilities: plasticity, to adapt to the new environmental conditions, or to migrate movement through dispersal. So the 2 main processes that need to be monitored is the estimation of the migration potential of the different species, and the migration potential of the different species can be inferred by combining fossil data and genetic data, in few words, by performing phylogeographic studies. I would like to show you some example of how a phylogeographic studies is organized, and I'm taking as an example Taxus baccata, which is a widespread conifer species with a highly fragmented distribution range in Europe. Generally, Taxus baccata population are characterized by a very small effective population size, and they are growing in a very huge environmental condition variation. This species is also very important because of the production of taxans, family of the diterpenes with antitumoral effect. We sampled several different populations, as you can see here from these slides, across the distributional range of the species, more than 5,000 individuals from more than 240 population, We genotyped this population using nuclear microsatellites and molecular markers. And then we applied some clustering, Bayesian clustering approaches, identifying 3 different gene pools, which are here indicated by the different colors: a Western gene pool, Eastern gene pool, and then that mixed gene pool in the Central Europe, where the 2 different gene pools met. We used, according to the distribution of these different gene pools and how these gene pools are diverse, how genetically they are diverse, we designed several different scenarios shaping the diversity in these species. And then we applied some methods, some Bayesian ABC approaches to identify which is the most likely scenario. The most likely scenario indicated here in these slides assumes the presence of 2 main refugia, one on the Iberian Peninsula, one in the Balkan Peninsula, with 2 migration routes meeting in Central Europe, originating the admixed gene pool. This test also revealed an ancient disjunct that predated the glaciation, following by a secondary contact at 6 million of years before present, 2.2 million before present, and 0.2 million before present. So according to all this information and summarizing all the data that has been collected through the different phylogeographic studies performed during the last 20 years, it has been possible to estimate the rates of spread of forest trees. And the rates of spread of forest trees are far below what would be necessary for species migration to track future climatic warming. In few words, 100 meters per year compared to 3,000, 5,000 meters per year. Those forest trees will probably have to adapt in situ to survive, and to adapt in situ, the different forest species rely mostly on standing genetic variation. So, in few words, the level of genetic variation present in natural population is extremely important. To estimate to detect possible adaptive variation, we first developed some genomic resources. Again, in the case of Taxus baccata, we sequenced the transcriptome of different individuals, sampled in different populations, and then according to different procedures, we identify genes, and within these genes, we identify some polymorphisms, some markers, more than 25,000 SNP markers. And we used these SNP markers to screen populations sampled along an ecological gradients, as you can see here from this slide, starting from the east to the west to the north, from the north to the south. Then we applied some methods to detect outliers and to find and to detect some possible association between these markers and climatic parameters. Applying these methods, we identify some outliers, some markers which were associated with the temperature, some others which were associated with the precipitation. Again, using another method, we identify again some markers associated with the temperature, some other associated with the precipitation, and combining the 2 different approaches, we identify 6 markers which seems to be significantly associated with an annual precipitation. In few words, some of these 6 markers display a higher frequency in the Western population where there is a lower annual precipitation. So these markers seems to display some signature of selection in these species. Similarly, we perform studies on maritime pine, Mediterranean pine species. The first step was, of course, to check for possible population structure in this species. We used some markers, some molecular markers, and we detected, as you can see from the map, a very strong genetic structure, probably associated with the history of this species, the presence of the glacial refugia during the last glaciation and the migration routes. Then we used some methods to find again association between markers, these markers, particularly SNP markers and climatic parameters. And we focus our attention only on those markers showing significant association with all the different methods. The very end of the story, we detected 18 SNP markers, which which are strongly correlated with climate, and particularly with winter temperature. So there's 18 markers showing some signature of selection, which are highly correlated, significantly correlated with the climate, in particular with winter temperature. We used then these markers to try to predict maladaptation to climate in pine species. We took advantage of the presence, the availability of a common garden experiments, which was established by our Spanish colleague in Spain to estimate fitness, in particular survival. Then the second step was to compute optimal allele frequency given the site climate. Third step was to compute genetic distance to optimal genotypes for all the array of populations. And the very last step was to test for correlation of climate distance with fitness. And the results were quite interesting. Because we detected a significant and negative correlation. In few words, the average frequency of locally advantageous alleles based on these 11 SNPs, which are associated with climate, was significantly correlated with survival. Of course, I was stressing the importance of genetic variation. Genetic variation is a prerequisite for adaptation to new environmental conditions. But during the last year, the discovery of genetically depauperated but widespread species, such as is the case of Pinus pinea, which I'm going to show you, is challenging a bit this idea. We try to identify all the possible highly depauperated species, genetically depauperated species, depauperated but widespread plant species. And then we ranked these species according to the level of diversity. So first step was to identify those that are depauperated. And then the second one was to rank the species in order, by order of increasing diversity. And as you can see here from these slides, the number of species showing or displaying a very, very low level of diversity is relatively high. And relatively high is in particular the number of conifer species or better of forest species displaying very low level of diversity. So of course, it doesn't seem to be an exception. I mean, the presence of widespread species, but highly depauperated. This is how generally Mediterranean species look like. Different colors indicated different gene pools. As you can see here, there are generally the Mediterranean forest species display very strong population structure, different gene pools, and the diversity within each of the gene pool is relatively high. So this is generally, this is the rule. This is how the different Mediterranean species look like. This is the case of Pinus pinea. Pinus pinea doesn't display or shows a very little, a near absence of diversity. All the different population genotypes so far were monomorphic for some molecular markers, with the only exceptions of some population in the Iberian Peninsula and in Lebanon, where some additional haplotypes at a very low frequency were detected. So it's really try to compare the two different situations. This is how they generally look like, and this is how Pinus pinea looks like. We used other molecular markers to confirm this very low level of diversity. We used the nuclear microsatellite, which generally are very polymorphic in all the Mediterranean species. And again, the very low level of diversity was confirmed, as well as using different markers detected in genes. As you can see here in Pinus pinea, the level of diversity was 1 order of magnitude lower than in the other Mediterranean, at least Aleppo pine and maritime pine, the other two Mediterranean conifer species. Still, we can detect some population structure, identifying two different main gene pools, the western gene pool and the eastern gene pool. But again, very low level of diversity and very low population differentiation or differentiation among the two different gene pools. We applied some methods to identify some demographic modeling, and then we compared the history of demographic history of Pinus pinea with maritime pine. So in contrast with other Mediterranean trees like maritime pine, Pinus pinea, effective population size did not recover after the last glaciation, but continued declining, as you can see here from these slides. And the divergence between the two gene pools is very recent, probably associated with new mutations. So according to this data, we try to hypothesize what happened with this species. Probably Pinus pinea was driven to almost extinction after several sequential bottlenecks following the glacial cycle in Europe, and at the end, approximately 150,000 years before present, only few trees remained, probably in a single population, but then from this very small population, Pinus pinea spread all around the Mediterranean, probably thanks to a combination of natural and human-mediated dispersal. So this seems to be the most likely scenario for this species. But irrespectively of how Pinus pinea was able to spread to its current distribution, the most striking question, the most interesting question is how it can still grow in a great variety of habitats while having such low genetic variation. And this is what the topic that we are investigating so far. So work is in progress specifically on this question and this interesting hypothesis. Of course, there are increased evidence of selection also at small spatial scales, including for forest trees. There are some examples, for example, particularly in some neotropical species, where there is a clear and significant signature of selection, signal of selection at a very small spatial scale. Our colleagues detected significant effect of waterlogging status to explain genetic distance, and they identify significant outliers loci using multiple methods at a very short spatial scale. But this is the topic of the presentation of Andrea, so I leave the floor to Andrea for the second part of our presentation.
So thank you, Beppe, and I'm sharing my screen. So this was Beppe's last slide. Beppe was telling us that levels of local adaptation can be.
Andrea, we cannot see. I cannot see your screen.
It seems it's shared.
No, we don't see it.
Okay, because I have two screens, so let me see if it's. I'm sharing on the other. Can you see it?
No.
And okay, only one sec, because we've two screens, you have to select which one.
Yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Usa l'opzione presentazione, Andrea.
Yeah. So this was Bepe's last slide. Beppe was telling us that levels of local adaptation can be inferred by studying the association between genetic characteristics and environmental condition, and or outlier genes that behave differently from genetic variation, which is not under selection. In these approaches, local adaptation is usually studied at a broad geographic scales, both to intercept large climatic variation and to be able to compare patterns of local adaptation between different genetic clusters or genetic or gene pools. As Beppe was saying, gene pools usually originated from different glacial refuge during past glacial cycles. But there are, this is only one of the possibilities to study local adaptation. Local adaptation can be studied even within population, using usually individual genetic data instead of population level genetic data. One possibility to study local adaptation within population at the very local scales is to simply replicate the sampling design and analytical approaches used at a broader geographic scale within population, usually selecting population characterized by high environmental heterogeneity, as the case of a Perua falcata shown by Beppe just before. But there are other options. There are approaches which rely on completely different theoretical expectations, theoretical basis, and which are, instead of being based on exploring the relationship between genetic variation and environmental characteristics, they are based on exploring reproductive patterns within forestry population. The general aim of these approaches is to estimate the reproductive success of each individual within a forest stand, and the expectation, the general expectation is that individuals with a larger progeny, with a higher reproductive success, should be better adapted at local conditions. What we usually see in experiments aimed at assessing reproductive success is that within a single forest stand, usually there are very few reproductive active individuals in terms of reproductive output. So there are very few individuals with high reproductive success, and the vast majority of individuals have little or no reproductive success. So the distribution of reproductive success within forestry population usually is L-shaped, highly skewed, and zero inflated. To estimate individual reproductive success in forestry population, we used a suite of statistical tools, usually called parentage analysis. The main goal of parentage analysis is to reconstruct the genealogy, which is simply to estimate which are the most likely mother and father of each seedlings within a stand. And this estimation is based on genetic, spatial, as well as phenotypic information. Once we are able, using parentage analysis, to understand for each sampled seedlings if he has local parents, only one local parents, or if he is it's coming from seed immigration, we can estimate for all the adult trees, which is the reproductive success, which is basically the count of assigned seedlings through parentage analysis. But once we know reproductive success, if we want to use parentage analysis to study the patterns of local adaptation, we don't have simply to count it. So we don't have simply to find out which are the trees with a larger reproductive success, but also why. There are several promising approaches to do this. I will show two of them. The first one is linking individual reproductive success to ecophysiological traits. So the investigation in this case is aimed at understanding which are the, among ecophysiological traits, which are the most likely determinants of differential reproductive success. We have recently carried out a study in this direction, which was based on combining parentage analysis and dendrophenotyping. The study is published in Heredity. It was published at the beginning of 2020. And it was based on studying reproductive success in 5 study plots, 2 from Germany and 3 in the Northern Apennines in Italy. Studying a total of more than 500 adult individuals and more or less 100 seedlings per study plot. For all the individuals, we gather individual genetic data at nuclear and chloroplast markers. And for all the other trees, we got a nice dendrochronological characterization through the collaboration with dendrochronologists. For all the other trees, we scored a set of dendrochronological dendrophenotypic traits, which were grouped in 3 main classes according to a recent paper in New Phytologist. So they belongs to the growth rate, the individual sensitivity to climate, and the individual growth responses to extreme climatic events classes, plus some spatial variables. We assessed their impact or their relationship with reproductive success using 2 different statistical methods. And these are the main results. We found in the end that there are 3 dendrophenotypic traits which are consistently, statistically significantly associated with reproductive success across the 2 statistical approaches used, which are the age, the average growth rate, and the correlation with the temperature of the previous vegetative seasons. Specifically, we found that trees with a larger growth rate are in general more successful. This independently from the age, because in generalized linear model, it is possible to assess the effect of a parameter given and remove the variance due to all the other parameters. We found also that older trees are more efficient in general as fathers, but the relationship does not hold for mother trees. In fact, mother trees are less successful above a threshold, an age threshold of about 160 years. And this is the most striking result, because we found that the better is the growth response to mean temperature of the previous vegetative season, the larger is the reproductive success. In the paper, we put forward several hypotheses about this relationship, and it seems is mainly related to the reproductive effort, which in Norway spruce is particularly heavy in the previous vegetative season with respect to seed dispersal. And but what is important to the aim of our talk is that by combining parentage analysis and dendrophenotyping, we were able to find a functional link between ecophysiological traits and individual reproductive success. And to our knowledge, this is one of the first demonstration of such functional link. And this has allowed us to isolate a set of ecophysiological traits which are good candidates to find which trees are better adapted to local conditions. The other approach which we deem as particularly promising is comparing the reproductive success of individuals from different provenances in common environmental conditions. So, for example, in provenance trials or plantation. Several years ago, we started exploring the genetic variation of silver fir, an European conifer in the Mediterranean area. We discovered that in Italy, there are two main genetic clusters, the blue cluster and the red cluster in the picture here. And these two main genetic clusters are separated by a steep genetic barrier at the latitude of Majella and Gran Sasso Massif here, at 45 degrees of latitude. This is an area of more or less 80 kilometers with no autochthonous silver fir stand, but several plantations. We got a project to understand the provenance of the genetic origin of this plantation, and we discovered that in this area there are plantations almost entirely originated in the southern cluster, and plantation almost entirely belonging to the northern cluster. But we found there is one with a 50-50 attribution to the two different genetic clusters. The trees from the different genetic clusters vegetating in this plantation are more or less have more or less a similar age, around 80 years on average, and there is abundant regeneration. So these conditions has raised the research question whether the reproductive success is balanced or not between the two different genetic clusters planted in the same environmental condition. So we ran again a parentage analysis to try to understand whether one of the two provenances is outcompeting the other in terms of reproductive efforts and success. So we sample and genotype all the adult trees present and 163 juveniles. And we ran an assignment test to the two different genetic clusters and the parentage analysis to understand the origin, the precise origin of regeneration. These are the main results. On the left, you see the results of the assignment test on adult trees. So this 50-50 distribution is confirmed. 43% of individuals belong to the northern cluster and 48% to the southern cluster. But juveniles, but the distribution in juveniles is very unbalanced, with only 10% of juvenile individuals assigned to the northern cluster and 73% to the southern cluster. This unbalanced distribution of assignment is confirmed by parentage analysis. In particular, we found that only 19% of juveniles have at least one northern parent, while almost 80% of juveniles have at least one southern parent. So, although the work in progress, and now we are working on dendrophenotyping in collaboration with Alfredo, the host of this nice workshop. We are working on dendrophenotyping to replicate the analysis done in the heredity paper, and to understand which are the phenotypic determinants of such unbalanced reproductive success between provenances. But however, with the results that there is a huge difference in the reproductive success of trees from the two provenances, with planted trees from southern origin, which are reproductively dominant, is a very important information for organizing future reforestation programs in Central Apennines, an area which was heavily impacted in the last centuries by human intervention, in particular due to grazing and cuttings. So this is our last slide. We have shown that a precise assessment of levels of local adaptation is crucial for implementing conservation measures and actions, and that genomic data provide the information needed to infer levels of local adaptation, offering several options for such investigation at different spatial scales, from the very local scale to the entire distribution of forest tree species. Our final remark is that if we don't know how forest trees are performing in their environment now and why, it will be hard to understand whether our forest will need help to track ongoing climate change in the near future. And thank you for your attention, and thanks also to all the collaborators which have helped us to get the results we presented today.
Okay, thanks really a lot to Beppe and Andrea for these very interesting talks. I guess also this kind of research is really another frontier in our knowledge of forest, especially in establishing some link between the phenotype and the genotypes and how they are interacting. There are still a lot of mysteries to be discovered outside there, and thank you very much for this. So we have some questions for you. Gianmaria Bonari for Beppe. Thanks for the interesting presentation. Can past afforestations, especially pine, confound the genetic signal? And also, how do you usually cope with this constraint in your sampling? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Gianmaria. Very nice comment, because of course we know that several species, or the original genetic structure of several species, have been blurred by human activities, not only in the Mediterranean basin, but also in Central Europe. So to deal with this problem, you have maybe two options. The first one is to take into consideration the historical records, in particular pollen data, fossil data, so that you can identify you can identify natural populations, or you can do something at posteriori. For example, it is very common that you identify some population which located in some specific region, which cluster with other gene pools, within other gene pools. And this is a posteriori criteria to identify possible population of non-natural origin. That's the main strategy, I would say, to deal with this question and to organize properly the sampling design.
Okay, we have another question from Mario Pagnotta. Climatic change is not only increased temperature, but rather increase of extreme event. So for this, genetic variation is essential, but probably plasticity would be even better solution for perennial plant to survive. Do you have data on plasticity? Looking at the variation distribution, could be possible to identify the genetic regions more important for plastic traits?
Okay, Mario, of course, I totally agree. This is the point, the first answer, very rapid answer. And the second is there are groups working on plasticity, but not in our specific case, so we don't have data so far. Regarding your second comments, low variation in Pinus pinea, of course, you are right. It should be considered as a more cultivated species. Of course, the diversity in this species is extremely low. It's probably due to human activities, but not only to human activities, but also to the history of the species, as we inferred by the modeling approaches that I was showing. Of course, I agree. It has been strongly managed by humans and cultivated because of the seeds, I mean edible seeds, but this is one of the possible factor lowering the diversity in the species.
Okay, thanks. Another last question for the two of you, from Olamidayo, with focus on restoring genetic variation of Mediterranean forest. What is the best approach for diversity recovery among species for adaptation to climate change? I don't know if...
So there is a huge discussion now about the utility of very active approaches such as assisted migration or assisted gene flow. But my opinion is that we don't have data now to understand how this, if this is useful. It's really useful at Mediterranean latitudes, and whether how it has to be fine-tuned, and so we need to understand the levels of local adaptation to understand if species must be helped in translocation, and we have to understand how can which is the range of gene flow in each species, because probably most species are really able to move far away from their current location, and so we need more data to conclude which is the best approach.
Okay. Thanks very much, really, Beppe and Andrea, for your very interesting talk. Thanks a lot. So now we invite Professor Donato Chiatante as the next speaker. Professor Chiatante is Emeritus Professor at the University of Insubria in Italy. He has a long-standing research interest in tree root adaptation to environmental factors. And he is gonna speak to us regarding the high quality selection of seedlings to improve forest resilience to global change, with very interesting cases from different parts of the world. So welcome, Professor Chiatante, the floor is yours.
Alfredo. So this presentation is about the quality of seedlings. In particular, I will talk about the effect of management in the nursery, and I will make two examples in USA and in Mongolia. So first of all, I would like to say that the demand for seedlings for reforestation, afforestation, plantation is increasing all the time. So as for example, only in Europe, in Sweden, more than 375 million seedlings are put in Swedish soil every year, just to give you an idea of the increasing demand in all the world about seedlings. So the nursery are under pressure for increasing the number of stock produced in 1 year. This means that the first problem is to have a new type of nursery, high-tech nursery, to produce a stock material in a sustainable way. And so the introduction of robots in the nursery is common now, improving all the time. And my group has been involved, for example, in the production of a portable grow chamber. And you can see here on the left that you can move this small grow chamber and take this grow chamber everywhere. The advantage of this portable grow chamber is that you can put it everywhere you want and control everything, the grow cycle at a distance, just by your desktop or even a phone, and you can just understand if everything in the grow chamber is going according to what is the intention. This is a prototype, but at a full scale, a small grow chamber like this, which is the size of a container, in 5 weeks can produce at least around 10,000 seedlings. And all the process is controlled. We have also a robotic, you can see on the right side, a robotic arm that can do small operation during, but everything is controlled. I mean, the intensity of light, the water, everything is controlled at a distance. So the man gets in the grow chamber at the beginning and goes there when the cycle is ended. So this is the kind of improvement of technological improvement. So the problem is that all the nursery are pushed to obtain quantity and quality, which is more interesting because is important as here the panel advertising for a private nursery says better seedlings today means that better forest tomorrow. So obviously the need to combine solid science and improvement of nursery management expertise to obtain quantity and quality. There is the need to have this combination, and we have heard in the previous presentation the importance of the genetic approach. My talk will not deal with the genetic approach, but let's see, I want just to focus in the management at the level of nurseries. So this problem of obtaining quality and quantity takes to this new concept of seedlings fitness for a purpose. I mean, and just by selecting fitness of seedlings for a purpose, this means target seedlings. So the production, not seedlings, but target seedlings. And target seedlings is directly connected to target plant concept, next generation plantation and everything. So there are different ways to evaluate the quality of the stock material in production in the nursery. And what is more important, it is not the number and the quality, but the performance of the seedlings produced when they are transplanted in the field, starting from survival and also what is the growth after plantation. There are several papers making a distinction of the way you can just check the quality of seedlings in the nursery. And these are divided in two main categories: morphological aspect and physiological aspect. This is very clear. I mean, I don't make a list here, but in literature you can find several morphological traits which give you an indication of the quality of the stock produced. At the same time, we have a long list of physiological traits which can be selected to check the quality of the material produced. But quality control in the nursery, I mean, you can check the inherent property which are deriving from the genomic origin of the material you have. But I will not talk about this. I will talk about alteration of inherent property that can be induced during nursery operation. And this alteration are important for what will happen after transplantation of seedlings in the field. This is an interest of my research group, which dates back to several years. when a European grant contacted us to understand if there was a way to check the potential of seedlings after preparation in the nursery, in particular after that the seedlings had been conserved at 4 degrees for several months. There was the need to understand the regrow potential of these seedlings after the storage at 4 degrees. So we just worked to find the right way to measure the root growth potential. And why I say this? Because this kind of research lets us understand the importance to look at the way the seedlings in the nursery are treated. This is an experiment where the container has been stained with copper carbonate, which is toxic to the roots. So this was a technique used is still used sometimes, but was used years ago because the root system of seeds growing in this kind of containers had an increase of number of lateral roots. So the idea was to have more roots able to make a good growth after the transplantation. We did this experiment just using different portion of the container, all the containers stained, only the wall, as you can see in the second panel, only the bottom in the third half. And the result we obtained are very complex. I'm not going to present the data, but just to let you indicate that this experiment was repeated several times, and in this case it was popular. You can see that the cuttings have been treated with the different containers stained with the copper carbonate in the different position. And the results here says that the significant result indicates that there is an effect, a very good effect in the number of roots that can be obtained with this treatment. Now, but what's happened when you treat seedlings in this way after transplantation? I mean, I'm talking about is this treatment giving some improvement also on adult plants, not only in seedlings after transplantation? I will skip it this one. I will go just immediately to the United States of America. I was in contact with a friend of mine who did it 30 years ago and transplanted the seedlings in the field. So we went back to find where this ponderosa pine seedlings had been transplanted. And after 30 years, we went to understand if there was the possibility to find if that treatment had maintained advantage or induced disadvantage in these trees. This is an example of the work we did there, and we excavated the control plant and treated the plants. And but before cutting the tree and collecting the root system, we did all the measurement to understand the anchorage, the mechanical strength of the anchorage of these trees. In particular, because these trees were planted on a slope. So the idea was to understand if the copper carbonate after so many years had represented the improvement of the stability of these trees or not. So this is an attempt to measure the mechanical stability of the anchorage. This is the way we did the excavation with the high spade by recovering the intact root system. The root system were then transferred in the nursery, and you can see here in the picture a part of the trees we just excavated. They were put again in the same position they were in the field, and all the measurement of the roots were collected in terms of length, volume, diameter, direction, and you name it, you have it. This is the kind of results we obtained. I want to just quickly make a focus on this picture here. You can see that it is the picture in different direction of the slope. So south, north, east, west, and south means downslope, north upslope, cross section east or west. But anyway, the result we obtained is that even after 30 years, you can see better in this panel here on the right panel. What is stained in pink color is what we call it in mechanical anchorage term, the cage. I mean, you can see on the left panel, the most important portion of the root system of an adult tree is called the cage, is represented by the taproot in the middle and all the lateral roots. In particular, the attention for the mechanical anchorage is the roots which we are called the sinkers, and which together with the taproot make the most important effort for the stability. And it is not very clear, but anyway, all the measurements indicate that the treatment made at the seedling stage have given a difference in the length of the taproot and the number and the volume of the sinker's root, which means that it should be, but we are still analyzing the results, the anchorage of these treated trees after 30 years, it should be better than the other one. This is another, but we skip it, is you can measure not only by hand, but also by LiDAR technique. But so we went back in the nursery, and now we are doing an experiment using a different type of container, just to let the taproot grow longer than the usual size of container. The idea is to transfer the seedlings in the field and see in years what is coming out. So now we go back quickly to Mongolia project. In Mongolia, there is a project named Green Belt, which goes from the east part of Mongolia for around 4,000 kilometers to the west border with Russia. And in this case, the Green Belt project is the project with the intention to afforestate part of the Mongolian land, which is under pressure of desertification. Already in the north part of Mongolia is a steppe, and but the the degradation involves around 85% of all Mongolian territory. The problem is not only in Mongolia, which is here in the east side of Central Asia, but the same problem is regarding a number of countries, the central part of Asia, you can see. So this project has been going on for 10 years, and several thousand of plants have been planted. But after 10 years, the problem was to understand how the growth of these plants was going. And in particular, the Green Belt project is a project necessary because, as you will see in the next slides, this land is very much degraded and is almost frozen for many months of the year. And so the growth cycle starts in May and closes in September, with the soil which is mostly frozen for all the rest of the year. So reforestation, afforestation, plantation is very difficult in this kind of environment. I just want you to listen to this picture here. See if I can start. This is what the environment where this kind of intervention must be done with a new plantation. And what we found is that after 10 years, you can see from this slide here, we have found that the seedlings after 10 years are almost now young trees. We have just excavated 125 trees of Ulmus pumila and Populus siberica. And we are still analyzing all the data, but you can see from the picture the result, because in our opinion, it was a mistake because they used seedlings with the wrong container. And you can see that all the roots of these young trees are almost shallows. This means that, I don't know, but it is possible that the stability of these trees in few years will become a problem with this kind of very strong wind going on all the time. So I don't know if they will be safe or will be uprooted. So the second experiment we have done was not in the steppe, but was in the Gobi Desert, where they have tried again along this green belt project. They have done some plantation. Here it is again the same problem with a strong wind. Mind that this picture were taken by me in the middle of the summer, and the wind and the cold. So imagine what is afforestation and reforestation in this kind of environment. Even in the desert, they have planted several seedlings coming from the local nurseries. And in particular, I want to just focus very, very quickly on this tree. This is Axolum amodendron, is a particular tree able to live in this kind of very, very hard environment. It's a very strange tree. And in the right panel, you can see the green, which is not made by leaves, but there is no leaves in this tree. This is small branches able to make photosynthesis. This is an autochthonous tree. But the problem with this tree is that it is not able to make a natural regeneration, because in this environmental condition, the seedlings do not grow. So here the nursery is important, because we are doing an attempt to produce high quality seedlings which can be able to survive after transplantation. Here an example of seedlings prepared in the nursery, and we have found that if we use a particular type of soil, we can have a good growth of seedlings with a good root system, which can be useful to survive during the first time or after transplantation. So the take-home message, what is it? That even the management in the nursery is very important to produce quality of stock material which can give better result after transplantation. So it must be more focus on the production, so that not only quantity but also quality, and in particular talking about quality and importance must be given also to the simple things as the containers, because they can modify and can influence very much how the plant, and you have seen this one in USA, that still remain the effect of seedlings treated with COP after 30 years. So I should just modify quickly the slide you have seen before by adding that for seedling fitness for a certain purpose, maybe also we should talk about the target containers, in the sense that maybe it is important to find the right type of container for the right type of seedlings to have the target seedlings. This is a closing slide, and this is what I was discussing with my collaborator to make a sort of attempt to build a new container. With this container, should be able to produce seedlings with the taproot. You can see here in the middle with a small small number of lateral roots in the main axis, but a lot of taproot in the bottom. This is when we want that the root system after transplantation starts to uptake water more at the bottom and less in the middle section of the root axis. That is all for today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Professor Chiatante. Very, very interesting. This talk on one of the great mysteries still remain around plants biology, the rooting system. We really know few things. So there is time for two quick questions. The first one is from Khan Azil from Pakistan. He asks, how is it possible for underdeveloped countries for producing quality and quantity of seedlings using this latest technology?
Using the laser technology, well, quantity and quality, I mean, if we talk about the container, it's just a matter of try to understand where the seedlings will be planted, because if the seedlings will be planted as they have done in Mongolia in a sort of soil where after 50 centimeters you find a layer of calcium, which is a sort of, it represents a sort of obstacle to the development of roots, means that you should produce seedlings with a higher a longer taproot, and when you transplant the seedlings in the field, you should make an hole deep in such a way that the seedlings goes after the layer of calcium and find a good environment to make his right the development. Is not just a matter of money, it's just a matter to understand where the seedlings will be transplanted and so prepare in the nursery. So it is just a matter of look, in this case, to look at the type of container. Up to now, we have just used the cheapest container available on the market, but I don't think that is a good idea to go on like this. For target seedlings, we need also target preparation in the nursery, in particular for the root system.
Thanks. Another quick question from Marco Iannacone. What about mycorrhizal fungi used before deforestation in order to better succeed in climatization?
Oh, that is a very good statement. I mean, I am not expert in mycorrhiza, but I understand the importance. So I agree completely that in the nursery, maybe also looking at the combination of mycorrhiza during the preparation can prepare seedlings better adapted to survive and give a very good grow improvement. Yes, I agree completely, but my research group is not expert in mycorrhiza, but certainly association of containers and induction of mycorrhiza in the medium, it could be another improvement of target seedlings preparation. I agree completely.
So unfortunately, we are out of time, but there are other interesting questions in the chat. So I guess that some of the questions can be answered directly by Professor Chiatante on the chat, if he can. So because we have to shift to the next presentation, but if you can put some replies to these chat questions, that would be great.
Thank you, Alfredo.
So thanks again very much to Professor Chiatante for this very interesting presentation. Now I leave the floor to my colleague, Professor Goffredo Philibek, who is going to moderating the next talk by Valentin Klaus. Please, Goffredo.
Yes, thank you, Alfredo. Good morning, everybody. I would like to very briefly introduce Dr. Valentin Klaus, who is a researcher in the grassland science group at ETH in Zurich, Switzerland. And he is an experienced researcher in the field on the issues of restoration and conservation of grassland biodiversity, especially with the focus on agricultural landscapes and even urban landscapes. So because grasslands even exist within urban habitats. So welcome, Valentin, and if you are ready, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Goffredo. Thanks for the nice introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining this talk and this very nice seminar. So I'm going to start the presentation in a second. So this should work, otherwise let me know, please. That will be a tiny bit of a bar on the upper
yes,
side.
yes, I can see your presentation.
Perfect.
Very well. Yep.
Wonderful. So hi to everybody again. My talk seems to be the only one that is really focused on grasslands, so I decided to give you an overview on the challenges and also possible solutions to grassland biodiversity across Europe. Actually, I'm focusing the talk very much on Swiss grasslands because I thought that many people of you might not know Switzerland so well, as it's a rather small country, but grasslands are particularly important here because of the, let's say, lively topography of the country with many sites which cannot be used for arable agriculture. So grasslands play a very important and vital role in this country. On the other hand, Switzerland is not, as many people might think, only alpine. So we have also about a third of the country as a plain, which is very intensively used. So Switzerland is facing the same issues of losses in biodiversity and ecosystem services in those landscapes as other countries in Central Europe. So there we are. So what you already learned about me, that I'm a grassland ecologist working at ETH Zürich. And I would just shortly like to point at two projects for people that are interested in the biodiversity of grassland ecosystems and ecosystem functioning. There is a larger project in Germany, which is called the Biodiversity Exploratories. This is very multidisciplinary, going through all ecological disciplines and testing the effects of biodiversity on ecosystem functioning, but also the interplay of land use and biodiversity. And the second project is called SuperG, which is an abbreviation of Sustainable Permanent Grassland Management. This is an EU multi-actor project in the Horizon 2020 framework, which is very relevant for people that are interested in the sustainable management of grassland ecosystems, and SuperG offers quite some workshops and outreach materials, so it might also be worth have a look there. Content-wise, I focused the talk on giving a short introduction into the relevance of grassland ecosystems, and then move over to grassland threats. So why is the area and quality of grasslands so strongly decreased in Europe? And from this, I'll move on to options to conserve and restore grasslands. What I'm going to present is partly my own work and partly the work of other people, which very nicely fits into this framework. So first, I would like to take you to a small journey to the world record of plant species richness. There was a very nice forum article published in the Journal of Vegetation Science, and as many of you might assume, the largest diversity on a larger scale can be found in tropical rainforests. So you see the table head here, the area on which the study was done. So if you look at 100 square meters, the highest number of plant species was found in a tropical lowland rainforest in Costa Rica. And the same is true if you move to larger scales. On the other hand, if you move to smaller scales, so starting at 49 square meters due to only a pinpoint, the highest numbers of plant species can be found in grassland ecosystems. So you see that all these ecosystem types and all the examples listed here coming from grasslands around the world, they are all found in grasslands, highlighting how important these ecosystems are to maintain biodiversity, because many of these species cannot be found in different or other ecosystems. So permanent grasslands are extremely valuable and important for biodiversity due to their high species numbers, and also because of hosting a lot of endangered and rare species. Furthermore, there is a vast diversity of ecosystem services that are provided primarily by grasslands. So it's not only the contribution to food production, so for animal feed, but also many public ecosystem services. For example, carbon storage, which is lower than in forest, but considerably higher than on arable land, water purification, and of course also recreation and tourism. So grassland ecosystems provide an outstandingly high multifunctionality in terms of ecosystem service provision. Furthermore, we also have to keep in mind that 35% of the utilized agricultural area in the EU is grassland, and a large share of this is, let's say, problematic or marginal land which cannot be used for other purposes. So moving back to the picture I've shown to the very beginning, this is actually a very nice flower-rich landscape. And the back on the left, you can see some whitish areas. So this is central Switzerland, rather flat area, but these are the Alps. So not too far away from this site. It's actually a restored site. So this one has been recreated on arable land by seed additions, and I'm going to tell you why. Most of the grasslands in Switzerland that are under agricultural management, and especially in the lowlands where you can go for more intensive grassland management, they look like this. So herbs, if there are any, they will never flower. And the grasses are, the diversity is reduced to a few number of grasses, which dominates the sport with, let's say, 4 to 6 harvests a year. This is, I guess, a mostly mown plot. Why is this the case? Let's take a look on the milk yield per cow in Switzerland. This is certainly also driven by breeding. So the cattle breeds have changed quite a lot, but the numbers are really convincing that there was an agricultural change towards more productive land. So in former times, one cow gave 8 to 9 liters milk. About 1900, when, let's say, these more species-rich, flower-rich meadows had a peak and showed their most extensive distributions. And nowadays, these very intensively managed grassland, they can feed cows with very high quality forage, which is also environmentally friendlier than compared to imports of soybean or other things. And you see from the milk cans that nowadays a cow gives about 25 liters of milk. So really strong and convincing numbers of daily milk yield. But actually having a grassland that is intensively managed is still among the better versions and scenarios, because many of these grasslands in the lowlands have been blown up, as you can see on the top left. So they have been converted into urban agriculture, mostly due to higher profitability, also of these so-called biofuels, which are not that bio. Quite a large part, especially in higher altitudes, has been abandoned. So the forest is spreading out. You see a tiny grassland patch in the front of the picture that is left, but in the back, this is all going back to forest and shrublands. Irrigation, which is usually the basis for intensification and fertilization, is an issue, especially in more dry grassland ecosystems. Then afforestation, so planting of spruce or pine forests on marginal grasslands. And we see that urbanization, so the spread of settlements consuming quite a significant part of grassland area, or the conversion to temporary grasslands, where you have a continuous renewal of the sward and usually reseeding with very species mixture. Furthermore, in grasslands that are still available and that are somehow conserved and stay as permanent grasslands, intensive fertilization is, of course, an issue. Very early cuttings that inhibit, for example, the breeding success of any ground breeding birds, or very high stocking rates, as you can see in this picture. Further issues are nitrogen depositions via the air. So although this looks like a beautiful and very natural picture, all these yellow flowers are dandelions, which are indicators of strong nutrient enrichment in these swards, which is inhibiting high plant diversity and especially inhibits rare and endangered species. Or as you can see here, just blown up and losses of grasslands that are so significant that for these yellow flowerish meadows that I showed in the background, which are lowland hay meadows, the estimation is that only 1 to 5% of the former area of species-rich meadows is left in total. So there was a very nice assessment here in Switzerland where people looked at the situation at 1950 that you see on the left. So the vast majority of these sites were very species-rich and only a smaller proportion was intensively used. And today the situation has completely turned around. So all the red area means that these are intensively managed grasslands that have replaced these very species-rich and also flower-rich communities. While for the faunal value, this is even worse because most of these very intensively managed grasslands are completely unsuitable. So the area that is poor or species-rich and that can be used by faunal species and contributes to the conservation of faunal diversity, this is even much smaller. So that's one reason why these lowland hay meadows became a Natura 2000 habitat. The code is 6510. And this picture is also a resown but very nice grassland patch that has been established on arable land in Switzerland. To give you another example, move a bit more towards higher altitudes and toward the southwest of the country. So in the Valais, there are very species-rich dry grasslands. So in that region, precipitation is very low, sometimes below 300 millimeters, depending on the part of the year you're looking at. And you see that the landscape has a very lively topography with rocks coming out, and it's actually almost a steppe ecosystem. That's also the reason why this steppe fescue is called Festuca valisiaca. Also, of course, there is much more spread of this species in eastern steppes. But still, these are very important and are so-called grasslands of national relevance in Switzerland. If you look at the situation in 1981, the small patches, so the landscape is composed of these, almost everything as grasslands. But when you look at the time series data, you see many of these patches are abandoned and forest is coming back. Some patches are remaining here in the vicinity of the village, for example, but a very large area of these habitats has been permanently lost to forests. And this is despite the Swiss farmers receive relatively high agricultural payments compared to other European countries. And what is left is like this island where you see a tiny heap of, let's say sand, which is not reached by irrigation measures and fertilization, obviously. So it's like a tiny island with a palm on top in the sea. And in this case, it's a tiny species-rich grassland patch of just a few square meters, surrounded by intensively managed typical grasslands. So we have this divergent situation that some of these grasslands are abandoned and those remaining are often intensified. So on the one hand, we have the land use change, conversion of grasslands to other types of ecosystems, and in line with this, the fragmentation and isolation of established grassland patches. And on the other hand, we have the intensification of remaining grasslands, which means that increased fertilization, cuts and stocking rate reduce the ecological quality of the site. In line with drainage or irrigation, leveling of grasslands, the reseeding, sward renewal, where species-rich but less productive swards are replaced by swards that you can manage intensively. So if we look at today's situation, and now I'm getting back to the Super-G project, we did an expert survey and we have looked at the grassland area in 11 European countries. And we did not want to only look back to what has happened, but we wanted to start from today and give a prognosis about the threats of grasslands. And you can see from the bars that the significant proportion of these grasslands are still strongly threatened, for example, by conversion to temporary grassland or to arable land. And the largest threat nowadays is actually assumed to be heat or drought stress. So climate change drivers are also kicking in. I must say, as an ecologist, heat and drought stress is not that bad for biodiversity because usually this restricts nutrient availability. But on the other hand, this might also reinforce irrigation and lead to an intensification of grasslands finally, which could also be an indirect threat to grassland biodiversity. But in all the other cases, you see that grassland biodiversity is being lost if the grasslands are converted. So yeah, grasslands are still under a significant threat in Europe. From this, moving towards conservation and restoration strategies, and if you look at the picture to the right, a typical mid-elevation landscape around 1,000 meters of height in Switzerland, and you see very many different shades of green. You see very intensive production and very, let's say bright green, and then up here more brownish green. So the landscape is very patchy. As you can also see on the left picture in the back, there is more intensively used grassland, and the forefront here, there is an extensively used, very flower-rich grassland. And how is this, like, on what is this based? So it's not only the decision of the farmers. Of course, if you have a steeper slope, you cannot manage that intensively, but there is also a strong relevance of agri-environmental schemes. So environmental schemes shape Swiss landscape and the grassland landscapes a lot. And the options for conservation and restoration of grassland biodiversity, I will go through our organic farming, biodiversity-friendly management, agri-environmental payments, which often involve reducing the management intensity of grasslands, and then 2 examples of restoration, one in existing grasslands, so to introduce species in species-poor grasslands which are managed at low intensity, and the second one is a recreation of grasslands. And then at the very end, I would also shortly like to talk about how to bring this knowledge and these findings into action. So organic farming has been shown, and this is one of the studies that are coming from this biodiversity exploratories project that has been done by myself. You see from the upper left that the comparison between organic and conventional grasslands does not show any positive effects for plant diversity, but for arthropod species. So both predatory and herbivorous arthropods profited from organic farming and grasslands. On the other hand, we see that the yield was not that much different. So the median was a bit lower in the organic ones, but actually due to strong environmental variability, the yield losses were not too big actually. But you see that organic grasslands are on average much less intensively used. So we've calculated an index including mowing, grazing, and fertilization intensities. And this index combines all 3 of them, and you see that overall organic grasslands are managed less intensively. So organic farming seems to be an option to help arthropod and insect species to survive in more intensively used landscapes. The second example is also targeting towards insect species. So it has been shown that the use of a conditioner, so a machine that is taking the freshly cut grass and all the above ground biomass, and this is kind of folding the stems of the grasses to enable them drying up quicker. So conditioners are very bad for insect diversity because most of these insects are folded as well, and usually they don't survive this. So in all ecosystems that still have a significant number and abundance and richness of insect species, conditioners should definitely be abandoned. On the other hand, you see that also the mowing process surely harms the insects, and the suggestions of Van den Poel and Zeem in this article was that the farmers could just add this metal stick which goes through the vegetation before it's cut, and if this touches plants where insects are resting on leaves, for example, usually the strategy of the insects is that they drop down, so they hide in the vegetation. And if you keep a certain mowing height of, let's say, 10 centimeters which leads to only small losses in yields. These animals are not killed. Also very good for example, frogs and ground breeding birds. So mowing height of 10 centimeters is very favorable. It's also about the process of mowing. Usually farmers start mowing from the outside of a grassland and then go towards the inside, but then they have their final run because all the animals have been moving more to the central part of the grassland, and the last row they cut is usually the one where all the hares are sitting in, or maybe even deers. So if farmers start mowing from inside of the field towards the outside, then all the animals can rather move to adjacent patches or to the forest. And the numbers of injured and killed animals is much reduced. Another strategy that has been established in Switzerland, but also in southern Germany, for example, is to leave stripes of grass during each cut. So 5 to 10% of the area are left. Here you see an autumn picture. This is why the grass looks a bit strawy, but these grass stripes, they provide habitat and resources during summer, because usually grasslands are all cut at the same point in time, even if they are under any agri-environmental scheme. Mid of June, they are all gone, and so are all the floral resources. And if these stripes are left on the parcels, then the species can still hide and forage there, and they can also reproduce. So during winter times, it's very important to keep some of these stripes. And the studies have shown that the losses in yield quality, if you look on the hectare scale and you mix these, the biomass that you're going to cut in the new year, if you mix all this, the losses are pretty low. So this is a very promising, rather novel method to help insect diversity in grasslands that are still under agricultural use. And the higher the ecological value of the grassland type itself, of course, the higher the impact of this measure. So if you do this in a lolium sward with only a few species, you might also have positive effects, like a sainfoin monoculture. We could even leave those with stripes, and there are still flowers provided to animals. So that works in intensive and low intensive grasslands. Moving towards agri-environmental payments, the example of Switzerland is nicely shown on this picture. So you see the high growing flowering area in here, and in the boundary, this is the intensively used grassland. So farmers are being paid to delay the first cut and also to restrict stocking densities and fertilization. That's one of the main reasons why we have this patchy grassland structure in Switzerland. And based on this action-oriented measure where farmers restrict their activities, this is why it's called action-oriented, we have result-oriented measures. I call them quasi-oriented, quasi-result-oriented, because they are based on the action-oriented. So what they add is that the grasslands which are being also paid for the second quality criteria, that they have a catalog of target species, and the farmers can take a look themselves, but afterwards they're professionally mapped. And the system is that farmers are being paid for the action-oriented if they apply to these rules and they register. And in a second step, they can additionally paid if these target species are on the plots, because the situation is that if you reduce management intensity on an intensively managed grassland, biodiversity does not automatically come back. But I will come to this in a minute. So this is financially very attractive to farmers because the payments are significant. It's also related to cross-compliance. So the overall payment of funds for the farms. Farmers generally prefer more the result-oriented over the action-oriented measures because it gives them a bit more flexibility, but not in Switzerland, where the result-oriented also includes the action-oriented measures. So that's actually not that straightforward. Key plant species are needed for these higher payments, which is a motivation for farmers also to reduce plant diversity. And you see from this graph that over the last years, the area of these grasslands under agri-environmental schemes, they went up quite a lot. And now I will move over to this introduction of plant species in species coursework, because if you have such an intensive grassland and you extensify the management over time, plant species are not coming back for several reasons. Seed limitations, so no source populations, plants are dispersal limited, and there is also microsite limitation, meaning that plant seeds that arrive on the site cannot germinate. So what is being done is that we plow up tiny patches in those grasslands, and this is an experiment that I've established with colleagues a couple of years ago. So we have disturbed the sward, we have added seeds of interesting and important plant species, and the result was that if you look at the disturbance, yes, and seed addition, yes, we see that only the combination of disturbance and seed addition was effective in increasing species numbers by 50%. So this is obviously an option to increase plant diversity and grasslands by, let's say, establishing such windows of opportunity, which are blown up only on a small scale. So we don't need to blow up all the grassland area and reseed it, but it's only a small area that is being disturbed and species are coming up. And now, as a last point concerning restoration measures, I would like to mention the recreation of grassland on former arable land, and this is often done with a hay transfer. So you have a species-rich site that is somewhere close to your restoration site, and you harvest green biomass, and with all the propagule and seeds, you move this to the restoration site and you spread it out on the site. You can also just harvest the seeds. So this is a seed harvester on a species-rich, old and ecological valuable grassland. Then the seeds are spread out. Some of these measures require topsoil removal. So the removal of the uppermost layer of the arable site is usually very much enriched in phosphorus and other nutrients. So some of these sites will need an adjustment of the nutrient level, but afterwards, this recreation of grasslands works very nicely. I will jump over this for time reasons. So the restoration of grassland, and I said this picture I've showed in the very beginning, this is also restored grassland. This works very well, but it's quite expensive, an expensive measure, and might also be very drastic if you remove the nutrient-rich arable topsoil. The last point I would like to shortly address is that we also need to bring our ecological knowledge into action. So some of you might know biodiversity ecosystem functioning experiments, which have shown that increased plant diversity can be very beneficial also to provisioning services and to many other ecosystem services, but such knowledge often stays only within the scientific community and is not being communicated to stakeholders. So some measures like here, the introduction of a multi-species swards during the conference of the European Grassland Federation, addressing farmers directly and talking about advances in ecological and sustainable management. These are very much needed, and there are a few promising examples like these information brochures on agri-environmental schemes or biodiversity-friendly grassland management. This is on the effects and benefits of organic farming on biodiversity, or also these seed mixtures and how you properly use them. These are very much needed to spread the knowledge. And that's also a reason why I'm so happy that I was invited to this workshop, because I really like talking about the advances that we do and also bring them into action. So my final slide shows the conclusions. Grasslands are valuable. We need to make the society aware of this, because it obviously also costs a bit of money to preserve these species-rich grasslands. Grasslands are also still vulnerable, so threats and risks are ongoing. The conservation of existing grasslands is more important than the recreation, and this is more important than the degradation. So the first point should be to conserve established grassland ecosystems that are of high nature value, and the next step would then to be restore those on degraded sites. And as I'm just shortly briefly mentioned that outreach and dissemination is so important. We should all talk about this and make grassland conservation happen. And with this, I would like to thank you. And yes, if there is any time left, I'm also happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Valentin, for this very interesting overview of issues on grassland conservation in Europe. We have a few questions from the audience. We are a bit short on time, but I'll try to present some of them. For instance, there is a question from Mauro, who asks that mowing always in the same direction involves some problems in he says in the land, in the surface of the land, that in agriculture must be as flat as possible. So how is it possible to conciliate what the farmers need with what the conservationists suggest? That is, how is it possible to reconcile the needs of farming practices with conservation practices in mowing?
Yeah, this is true, because it's obviously a trade-off. So intensive production, and I think we all prefer like the grown grass in our countries over imports of soybean and other things. So we also want to maintain this production. I think that enforcing grazing on areas which would need to be leveled for mowing purposes, I think this is a very important point, that that also land which is either being abandoned because it has maybe like rocks going through the sward and on the surface, or is then being leveled to that it can be intensively used. I think those areas are particularly well suited for grazing. And if we restrict grazing, maybe that we leave out some patches as we do for mowing, then this can still contribute to the conservation of grassland biodiversity. So I think there we also need to go more towards creative solutions, let's say here, and leave the path of like standard recommendations, which throw all the grasslands in one pot and give one recommendation.
Yeah, thank you. And also there was a question from Mario Pagnotta, who asked a clarification about your comparison about milk production. That is, he says, if the comparison is only through time, the problem is that there was also a great improvement in animal genetics. So the increase in milk production can be due not just to the to the intensification in grassland use, but also in different animal breeds.
Yeah, absolutely right. So I very much agree. I actually tried to include these advancements in animal breeding. That's what I meant with breeding, and not only plant species breeding, but of course the animals. The point that I wanted to make is that these new breeds, that they rely on very high quality forage. So you cannot feed mid-July hay, which looks almost like straw, to these dairy cows. So it is going, let's say, hand in hand, that that the results or the effects of breeding or the cattle, that they also result in higher nutrient and forage requirements of the animals.
Okay, there was one more question from Pakistan, from Khan Hasir from Pakistan, who asked what is the role of community in grassland management? I guess he meant the human community, so perhaps you have already answered this question in the last part of your presentation about the involvement of local people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think local people can take action, and they often take action, especially if areas are abandoned. So there are very nice examples where people take care of of meadows that have been abandoned due to agricultural reasons. And because it's so important to them, because it's also their national and traditional heritage, that they go there with this and take down the grass and remove this and maintain those sites. I think this is a local perspective that people are often getting active and want to preserve their, really their traditional grasslands. And on the other hand, I think we also need the societal acknowledgement of the importance of grasslands. In Switzerland, this is kind of well done. I know that from other countries, as in Germany, grasslands are, let's say, the worst or like the ugly little sister of arable ecosystems. And I think we should change this view due to the high multifunctionality of grasslands.
Okay, thank you very much, Valentin.
Thank you.
There are a few more questions, but unfortunately we are short on time. So maybe if you are available, you can answer them in written form in the question and answer window. Thank you very, very much. I'll give the floor back to Alfredo for the prosecution of the conference.
Thanks very much, Goffredo and Valentin, for this very interesting session on grassland ecosystems. Now I will give the floor to Zoltan Kun from the Frankfurt Zoological Society and the initiative Wild Europe. He is very active in both scientific advancement and policy development at the European level for the conservation of our forest for a sustainable future. So Zoltan, welcome. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone to this webinar. Thank you, Alfredo, for inviting me. I will try to share my screen and then proceed with the presentation. I hope you see it and I hope you hear me.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, excellent. And let me take this down. Yeah. So basically, I'm going to talk about current development of forest and biodiversity related policies, the role of science or the scientific sector, I should rather say, and the NGO sector. I represent here Frankfurt Zoological Society in Wild Europe. I basically work together with Heather Keith in the same research project, what she presented earlier as a first speaker, together with Griffith University. So the work that I present here is due to the same grant, what was used for Heather's research. Just short introduction, personal introduction. I'm based in Hungary. I'm Hungarian. But currently I work more on the European level, EU level. Let's see if I can, yes. So my first slide, it might look a bit strange. Nothing has to do with forest or grasslands. And I forgot actually to say that my presentation largely focused on the forest habitats. I just saw this in an earlier presentation last week when we had the Science Day here in Hungary, and we were happy to see various scientific presentations arranged by universities and research institutions. It's basically a simplified food web of the Northwest Atlantic. Not that simple though, at least. So the question is really whether everything is connected to everything. The message at the meeting was not directly, but because some elements in this food web are not directly linked to each other, but there are kind of keystone species, key species that if we take them out, then maybe the whole food web collapses. I used that because I wanted to present how complex the policy work and the policy arena is. And let me start with this, that obviously our interest really lied at biodiversity. We would like to protect biodiversity. We would like to hold the biodiversity loss. Then suddenly climate change, climate breakdown started, which is largely driven by human influence. BNR started to talk more about that these two, the biodiversity crisis and the climate breakdown, are interlinked. They shouldn't be seen separate. And we have to look at the ecological integrity of habitat types. And then if we do restoration, we should aim for functioning ecosystems in the restoration. In terms of forest and forest habitats, or maybe also other habitats, I wanted to show that first in Europe, and sorry, I largely talk about the EU policies, but hopefully it will have some implication for others who are watching this presentation from outside Europe. Surely the European policy impacts everyone, because Europe is kind of seen as a front runner on environmental issues. I must say we are not really, or at least there are serious question marks whether we are really front runners. So the biodiversity policy is one element that obviously impacts these forest and this all this debate about biodiversity, climate, ecological integrity, functioning ecosystems. There are international levels of the biodiversity policy, the CBD, post-2020 biodiversity framework, and the IPBES. In Europe, there are, or within the European Union, there are kind of resonations of all of these. The EU biodiversity strategy for 2030 that has been published, was published in May this year. Then we have a so-called nature directives, the habitat and the bird directives that are very strong legally binding laws. The biodiversity strategy is a soft law. I would call it as a soft law because it doesn't really have legally binding targets. Then there is the water framework directive, flood directive as well. So these deals largely with water-related habitats or fresh waters. Then the EU post-2020 forest strategy, which is currently under discussion, and I'm going to talk about that later. The European Parliament has approved a report on the role of the European Union on forest protection globally and forest restoration. The biodiversity strategy also included an EU forest law. Then there are the climate-related policies which impact, obviously, biodiversity policy. Again, there are international level IPCC, the UNFCCC, and in Europe we have the climate law, renewable energy directive that runs or drives a lot of logging in Europe. Again, I will talk about that a bit later. LULUCF, the land use and land use change and forest, emission trading system, effort sharing regulation. Then there are the trade policies, the financial policies like the multi-annual financial framework, the EU financial taxonomy on sustainable investment, and the EU Next Generation or Recovery Initiative. And these are all linked to each other, obviously. So if we try to influence one, like the biodiversity policy, then we might miss out influencing a very important driver like the Renewable Energy Directive. Or if we focus on another one, then we again might miss out something. So this results that we can get lost, really. Scientists or NGOs, if we focus purely on one policy, we might not address the right driver. We might address only the biodiversity policy. That's a dead end. So the situation is almost as complex as the food web of the Northwest Atlantic. Why we should bother with the policies? Because the title of this workshop is Conservation and Restoration of Forest and Grassland Ecosystems, strategic tool for addressing the environmental crisis. Policies are among these strategic tools. I mean, if we have good policies, we hopefully can get good results on the field. Obviously, policies has to be enforced as well. That's another critical element. But if we have wrong policies, then the enforcement will not really work either. By working on the field, it's very important and critical. I mean, these are all very critical. I think our good intention might be destroyed easily if there are only bad policies or a lack of enforcement. And the example in terms of forest protection versus forest as biomass for energy, I mentioned to you earlier the Renewable Energy Directive, which considers forest biomass as a carbon zero and renewable energy source. Between 2009 and 2015, the energy use of forest biomass increased with 1/3 in Europe. That's a huge increase. This derived most of or the largest section of the increase of forest harvesting in Europe within that period. If we look at the 18 years time scale, between 2000 and 2018, this increase is 50%. At the end, the result of all of this, that half of all wood, all the timber that we burn in Europe, half of the wood that we use, we actually burn for energy. And I'm not talking only about the houses, like the residential use of fuel wood, but the industrial scale of fuel wood has skyrocketed as well. We cannot ignore this as a driver, because the European Environmental Agency report said that only 15% of the forest habitat inside the so-called Natura 2000 network is in favorable conditions. And the member states of the European Union considers logging as a major threat for forest habitats. So we really, that's the reason why we really need to focus on policies. One possible objective that we could have is creating a fabric of legislation which recognizes basically what I said earlier, that the climate and the biodiversity crisis are inseparable. And that also means that it should be highlighted. And the reason why, again, I highlight that element, because today is the, by midnight today, you can still submit your comment on the roadmap on the EU forest strategy. And as it looks now, we are actually fighting back or trying to push back a little bit the forestry lobby. Forest doesn't mean forestry. And I hope that that was also clear from previous presentations, that forest offers not only timber as a benefit to the society. It also offers water purification, it offers clean air, habitat for species, pollinators, and so on and so on. So for us, we have to create a fabric of good legislation. And the coming 14 months are actually quite critical to influence the vivid policy-making environment in Europe. And afterwards, we have to deal with the enforcing the legislation and field projects. And we need to work through a global cooperation, because again, we shouldn't forget that the EU as a big consumer has large impact also outside the European Union. The project partners that are in the same project, as I said, Heather, Keith, and I work in here, from Europe to Nepal, or from the US to Australia, varied partners all across the globe, basically. And we are currently focusing on temperate and boreal forests. What are the global aspects of this policy framework? I mentioned already the ZBD Zero draft, which aims suggests 30% protection. Within that, 10% strict protection. So basically 1/3 of the protected areas should be strictly protected. To me, the main question is are we able to actually meet this target? If we didn't even meet with the Aichi target of the 70%, can we confidently increase our ambition? And even going further, if we meet on this target on paper, what about effectiveness? And that's where the NGOs and also scientists can play a very strong role to prove how effective are the conservation measures, whether these are protected areas, whether these are indigenous and community conserved areas, or other effective area-based conservation measures. Scientists can have quite a lot to prove whether we are effective to respond on the climate and the biodiversity challenges. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration also offers a really good opportunity. You probably know that it's going to start from 1st of May and will last until 2030, aiming to preventing, halting, and reversing the degradation of ecosystem worldwide. 10 years, 10 actions. One of these actions are investing in research, scientific understanding of how to restore and adopt ecosystems. This is still a developing field, yeah. But researcher could play a very, very strong role in shaping the restoration of ecosystems in Europe and again, beyond Europe. How the EU legislation actually reflect on this global aspect? The CBD Zero draft is basically echoed in our biodiversity strategy for 2030. We also have 30% protection, 10% strict protection, with very strong focus on the remaining old growth and primary forest to immediately protect and mapped, monitored and protect. and then also mentions effective management. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is referred through actually a new proposal. This EU biodiversity strategy calls for a binding restoration law, and there was also an ongoing consultation about that element of the biodiversity strategy that was closed on the 2nd of December, a few days ago. But I think scientists can still submit separately, or NGOs, their view to the European Commission, how this restoration law should look like and what should it include. What is the opportunity for forest restoration? It's because this biodiversity strategy includes restoration degraded ecosystems, in particular those with the most potential to capture and store carbon and to prevent and reduce the impact of natural disasters. I think that could easily be applied to forest habitats as carbon-rich and biodiversity-rich habitat types. Also, the biodiversity strategy recognizes the complexity of legislation. So it actually refers to, for instance, minimizing the burning of whole timber. But the unfortunate thing is that this leaves, I mean, I attended a discussion where people were actually questioning what whole tree means. Is it the branches, the leaves, all the roots and all this kind of stuff? So there will be a lot of loopholes, a lot of discussion about the definitions on the various targets within the biodiversity strategy. It also calls, this biodiversity strategy calls for investing in nature conservation, nature restoration, which is also critical for Europe's economic recovery after the COVID-19 crisis. And hopefully there will be significant amount of funding available for this element. And as I said, it calls for reviewing the RED II, the Renewable Energy Directive. And here comes the forest strategy. I mentioned to you that there is currently a discussion. The aim of the European Commission is to publish that forest strategy around March next year, end of March next year. There might be a slight delay because the public consultation has to take about 12 weeks. So I think there will be a little bit of a delay. But anyway, we really have to work together, the scientific and the NGO sector, to guarantee that the forest strategy is not becoming a forestry strategy. Unfortunately, there are contradicting European Parliament reports. There was one report approved on the 16th of September on the EU's role to protect and restore the world's forest, which clearly said that the competence on forest issues are shared between the European Commission and between the member states. And then 3 weeks later, the same European Parliament on the 8th of October approved another report which said, no, forest competence lies with the member states. And that's, I mean, that's only one of the contradictions basically in this report. And we have to tackle that contradiction. We really have to make sure, as I said, and let me repeat it, sorry for my repetition, but forest is not forestry. It's much more than forestry. Sustainable forest management is obviously a must, but it's not the ultimate solution. And it doesn't replace strict protection, which would mean non-intervention. So I would argue that sustainable forest management is something that has to be done outside the strictly protected areas, not inside the protected areas. Also, we have to recognize that sustainable forest management is not, for instance, a proxy for considering burning wood as a carbon zero solution for producing energy. We also have to have a better coverage of forest habitats. That's a very critical element because currently most of the strictly protected forest areas are in high mountain areas. And that results or leads to extinction depth on a long run, which I think is confirmed by the EEA report on the state of nature in the EU, because after the previous report, the habitat conservation status of habitat didn't improve. Actually, there was even further degradation. In terms of the restoration law, I think that offers a very new opportunity to actually restore natural functioning ecosystems and natural forest. there is an element in this strategy that calls for planting 3 billion trees, but I don't think that that's the solution really, because quantity over quality could be a big problem. Planting monocultures, for instance, monocultures of, I don't know, native trees, for instance, like it happens in Spain and Portugal with eucalyptus, it's not a solution for the biodiversity and the climate problem. So I would more argue for quality of forest than the quantity or the number of trees. And anyway, planting 3 billion trees could become a problem also for grassland restoration or restoration of other habitat types. There is one other element which is interesting. The biodiversity strategy calls for the restoration of 25,000 kilometer free-flowing rivers in Europe, which I think, again, it's a very good opportunity for forest habitats, but also for grasslands and other wetlands. But restoration, and that's a key message, restoration is not something that replaces the other argument that we have to protect immediately and urgently and strictly the best what we still have in terms of old growth and primary forest in Europe. There are, as I said, there are legally binding laws, the 2 nature directives, the Birds and Habitat Directive. The Europeans or those people who are in the call and are coming from EU countries, they probably know these, but there are other legislation that could be relevant for meeting the 30% target in Europe, like the Water Framework Directive. But all the success could be undermined by wrong or bad laws in terms of climate related legislation, especially the RED II, which again considers burning forest biomass as a carbon zero and renewable, which in a given time frame, Europe would like to become carbon neutral, or EU would like to become carbon neutral by 2050. Within 30 years, I don't think that forest could be considered as a renewable and carbon zero solution. So what's the role of the science and civil society? Contribute to the formulation of this new fabric of legislation, that's obvious. Deliver the evidences to decision makers, that's very critical. The evidence is about successes, but also about degradation. We have to talk to decision makers, contribute to public consultations, and I put here one link, and this is a new website that we set up a few weeks ago, the forestdefenders.eu website, where you can actually find all this legislation that going on, the current ones, also past ones, and the upcoming ones. That could be an interesting tool to use. And you also have to use your network to act on the drivers, like explaining politicians why burning wood is not a climate solution. And obviously scientists have a big role to educate the future decision makers as well. This is one example when we managed to get scientists to go to the decision makers in Europe. This is a letter that was signed roughly by 300, 400 scientists all around the globe. Roughly one third of them were European. That was sent to the European Parliament, 3 committees of the European Parliament, to argue about this topic in terms of the RED II Renewable Energy Directive. Similar letters could be very, very useful, and also references to studies. And the other role, obviously, I mean, as I said, first, we try to set up a new fabric of legislation, but then we also have to do the implementation. So we need to do implementation also together with science or the scientific sector, contribute to the implementation, monitor the impact of the law, input into potential changes if there is a problem, because we might have a very good intention and we argue for a change in the law and it turns out to be creating a new problem that I think has to be changed, and we need the evidences from the science sector. And if it's needed, then participate in petitions like this letter that I showed to you, or there is another example. We started also a petition addressing to the European Union decision makers, particularly the executive vice presidents, President Franz Timmermans, that we should stop burning, we have to protect forests and stop burning them for energy. This obviously, again, doesn't mean that we say everyone has to stop burning wood, because we know that for residential sector, this is timber is still a very important source of energy. But if you read it here, what we would like to say that it shouldn't be considered as a renewable energy source, shouldn't be counted against the renewable energy target. And well, once we have this, and I think this is my last slide, once we started the implementation, and if there is no any other tool remain, then we have to go to litigations. We have to take the bad guys to court. And just with the evidences, we have to prove how to enforce the legislations like the two nature directives. And here is one example, the EU biomass case. That is an example when we actually took the European Union to court over the renewable energy directive, claiming that they were actually not listening to best science. So there are official complaints formed that could be submitted to the European Union. And if, again, there is no any other tools, we have to use that. Thank you for your attention, and I will try to respond to questions if there is any. I don't know whether that's to me.
Okay.
There is.
Yes.
I stopped sharing my screen, maybe.
Yes, thanks a lot, Zoltan, for your presentation and for showing us how much complicated is nature conservation. And we really must account for not only the science, that's the starting point, but we really need to take into account the social context, economy, the political level, the legislation level. So it's really hard work, and people striving for this in the field, it's really doing good, huge work. So I have one question for this. What do you think, since we have very few time left to 2030 for reaching these ambitious targets, what could be a good strategy for you to maximizing the output from our forest in Europe, including biodiversity conservation, carbon accumulation, and climate change mitigation? Is there a view on your side to a way?
Yesterday there was a report coming out, and it was very timely. It came out from from Greenpeace, and it was written by Naturwald Academy, a German institute. They basically said that currently 77% of the annual increment of growth of forest are harvested in Europe. This should go down to 50%, and that would double the carbon accumulation in Europe's forest. I think that's quite feasible. But obviously, we have to do, I mean, there is no any other solution, I'm sorry to say, but the key is that we have to reduce our consumption. That's key. I mean, that really, I don't really see any other way than reducing the consumption of the of us European. And then if we do that, in terms of energy, for instance, and reducing the pressure on forest, is we have to invest in true renewable energy sources. We have to invest in carbon removal by forest and not by artificial, like the carbon, BECCS, or how they call it, BECCS technologies, which are unproven, but invest in forest protection. We have to invest in new technologies in energy storage and insulation, or reduce the consumption of energy. That's the potential. And by addressing the energy problem, I think we can significantly reduce the pressure on forest in Europe, and not only in Europe, but also, and I'm not talking about only the EU, but also outside. I mean, we are currently shipping pallets from Canada, from British Columbia and Southeast United States, Brazil. There are new projects from Namibia. They would chip down bushes and then transport it to Germany for energy, and that's called renewable. I mean, this is a scandal. This is a fraud. Yeah, the same applies in I think in South Africa. I just read a few days ago a proposal that some Dutch company is going to invest in shipping timber in South Africa, transship it to Europe and burn it in Dutch power plants for energy. EDF, I think it's a French energy company is investing in burning soy in French Guyana, and then they would clear cut a lot of forest. These are scandals. This has to be stopped.
Yeah, and the economy can really get crazy when.
Yeah, I mean, again, sorry, obviously I don't have an ultimate solution, and I don't think anyone has. But the only way how I see that gradually or immediately we have to reduce our consumption pattern. And we have to invest in, I don't know, really recycling economy. I also don't think that the bioeconomy is a solution. Making everything like I saw one project that the European Union is investing in innovation to produce fish food out of wood. That's not a solution either. That's not a solution. The bioeconomy is another dead end.
Just another quick question from Citi. When restoration needs a long time to bring back the origin forest structure, we might try another level of reforestation, but it usually brings invasive species, which could harm the forest itself. How the policy could anticipate the risks?
If I understand the question correctly, yeah, I mean, the invasive species are a very big problem. That's why I said that in the restoration, we have to aim using native local species. If I listened correctly, one of the speakers earlier, I think the third one, local tree plantation nurseries could be key in this. But yeah, I mean, the invasive species exist. And again, the risk of bringing them in more invasive into Europe has to be reduced as much as possible. I don't know whether that's a correct or satisfactory answer, but that's what I can say.
So Zoltan, please, you could maybe answer also.
Yes.
There is another question on the chat.
I will try to answer in writing. Yeah.
Because there is the time is very limited, but you can continue on the chat and replying to these additional questions for you. So now I want to call the last two speakers, of course, last but not least. We got a little bit of late, but okay, we put it in time. So we have Michael Jungmeier from University of Carinthia and Hans Kirchmeier from the Eco Institute of Austria. Welcome and thanks for being with us today. So Michael Jungmeier is a UNESCO chair for sustainable management of conservation areas in the Carinthia University. Is also senior research fellow at Eco Institute of Ecology. His research focused on planning and management of conservation areas in the context of changing societies. While Hans Kirchmeier is also now is the CEO of the Eco Institute in Austria. He focuses on naturalness and forest ecosystems, forest ecology, and ecosystem services and nature protection. He has been involved in several feasibility studies and planning and designation of procedures for protected areas establishment in Europe and also abroad. So please, Michael and Hans, the floor is yours.
So good morning to everybody. I'm very pleased to join this webinar, and also I would like to thank my colleagues before my presentation. I really thankful that Zoltan opened this wide field of legal background and protection, and these strategies helps us to save climate change and biodiversity. And he mentioned that protected areas are one tool in these conservation issues. And I would like to address some results from a pan-European process in managing forest ecosystem in the World Heritage property. And I would like to explain some findings of this process, which continues now for more than 10 years. So this World Heritage of ancient and primeval beech forests of the Carpathians and other regions of Europe contains at the moment about 80 component parts in 12 countries, but there's a process ongoing for extending this for another 30 parts. So at the end, we are facing a site covering 20 countries in Europe and more than 100 component parts with a total size of more than 100,000 hectares. I would like to show these sites on a map. So the green dots are indicating those sites which are already inscribed in the list, and the orange ones which are on the extension process. And I think it's very much trying to cover the last rare remnants of old growth and primeval forests in Europe. It's not covering all of them. It's focusing on the beech forest ecosystems, but it was very hard to find, especially in the western part of Europe, some plots of these old growth forests, which just underlines the importance of acting very fast.
Sorry, Hans, sorry, yeah. Could you put the presentation full screen?
Yeah, maybe I change the screen.
It should be the mid option in your line, in your top line. Okay, perfect.
Okay. So each of the World Heritage Sites need to address an outstanding universal value, which is, in the case of the beech forest, this post-glacial development process and the processes inside the forest ecosystems. So integrity and functionality of the ecosystem is the main target of this protected area, and it should explain the full European pictures of these beech forest ecosystems. So in the means how to manage such protected areas, it's very clear that for the core parts, for the property itself, there is a strict non-intervention management. So this is rather easy to be explained and to be fixed in laws, as non-intervention has some clear regulations. Of course, there's no forest management and no construction of new infrastructure or other uses like this. There are some difficulties in clarifying the game management or some collection of mushrooms, how this will impact the ecosystem, and it should be reduced as much as possible. But even if the property itself is strictly protected, there might be some impacts from the outside, and we have an instrument of buffer zones to address these protection from these outside impacts. We are recording impacts from forest management at the neighboring forest sites, which have impact on the microclimate, especially at the boundaries. Then there is, of course, emission of gas, pesticides, or fertilizers from settlements, agricultural areas, roads, and things like this. There is exposure to species, invasive species, which has been already mentioned in the discussion of the last presentation, and new pests invading from other continents into European forest ecosystems. And the change of the land cover has an impact on the mesoclimate, which can enhance the impact of climate change and the warming on our property, which should be avoided. So this instrument of buffer zones, I want to focus in my talk, should protect the property itself, the old growth and primeval forest from negative impact, from threats from the outside. And of course, it would be the best to have really vast buffer zones, large buffer zones around our properties. But as we are located in Europe, and it's a highly populated and managed area, we really have difficulties to make such large buffer zones, to establish such large buffer zones, and put them under a rather strict regulation to protect from outside. The advantage to have buffer zones is that this can be these buffer zones should be and can be controlled through the World Heritage Management. So having some landscape in the buffer zone enables the the World Heritage Management to influence the land use on these territories. So having large buffer zones is enabling a better protection for the property. The functionality of these buffer zones is defined by an IUCN paper, IUCN World Heritage paper published in 2009, giving three main functions: this protective function, this protection values to the property, then maximizing the connectivity of the World Heritage property to the outside ecosystems and surrounding landscapes, and to integrate the World Heritage property in landscape conservation and link it to some sustainable use. So we found it very hard to address all these three functions in one type of buffer zone, and that's why, for the first time, we in the history of natural heritage, we split the buffer zone in two subzones: the protection buffer subzone and the landscape conservation subzone. This led to some discussions and confusions, but I would like to argue why we found this decision as very helpful. When you look at the availability of areas, forest areas or landscapes for protection, you will have this scheme, I think, similar all over the world, that the more strict the protection and the regulation is, the less area is available through conflicts with other land users and property rights. That's lead to the structuring, especially at the buffer zone. So it's clear the property needs a very strict protection, and we find only a few places left in Europe which are covered by old growth and ancient or primeval forests, and it's very important to guarantee strict protection to these sites. And in addressing the buffer zones, we were facing the situation that if we have buffer zones with a very strict protection status, only small areas are covered by these protection buffer zones. And giving the opportunity to enlarge the buffer zones by the landscape conservation buffer zone with less strict protection, this is a big outreach of these World Heritage sites. So while having in the old already inscribed sites only one buffer zone, this is usually limited to existing protected areas, and depending on the current legal situation, it's sometimes smaller or bigger. It's a quite undefined set of regulations in the existing buffer zone through the history of three extensions in the past. And then new concept would clearly define two different subzones with a more strict protection and a lesser intensive protection in the outside area to increase the spatial outreach of this protected area, of these World Heritage sites. One big challenge was to agree across these 20 countries on the rules and regulations for these different subzones or for the property itself. It's a long ongoing process to bring all the site managers and the state parties on board to decide on a common approach how and what should be regulated. We introduced in this discussion a tool, we call it the regulation donut. It's a system to visualize the total set of impacts we listed. It's about 44 different types of impacts. You can see some of it. It's some dealing with the forest management practice, how to deal with sanitary cuts, with cutting for firewood, this for local residents, but also for the touristic use and some infrastructure development. So all this is tackled and listed explicitly. And we decided how it should be regulated in each of these three zones or subzones, if it should be allowed if it should be restricted to specific areas or restricted to special permissions, or if it's not allowed. So this discussion is still ongoing. We are very close. It's only about 2 or 3 of the land uses which we have not an agreement between the 20 countries. But this discussion is important to come up with a clear regulation for this ecosystem across the different countries. So after some years of discussion and refining this approach and this guidance document on the management, I would like to zoom up some findings, which links the need in the protected area management with the research. We want to base our decision making on some scientific results, and we see some open questions there. So to agree on a common standard of rules and regulations for this buffer zone management, we need maybe some more input on some clear documents where we can base our decisions on. So this is a good understanding of the negative impacts and risks that should be mitigated by the buffer zones. And we found quite a low number of studies that we are focusing the impact of forest management in neighboring stands on beech forest ecosystems. There are some microclimatic research across different ecosystems, conifer ecosystems, also from Australia, from the tropic, but on the beech forest, we don't have such clear data how far a neighboring clear cut would have an impact on the neighboring stands. And what else is missing is some good indication on the change in the land cover, on the climate of the landscape, on this mesoclimate. We would need more evidence how land cover changes will affect on the forest of our World Heritage property. Then wording and definitions are also something important in the international field of nature conservation and protected area management, as we are working across a lot of different countries and they have different tradition in forest management, and we need to bring all these management measures into a common system to understand the ecological impact and how it should be regulated. And there is this IUCN threat list. We think it's needed to refine and break it down for the forest ecosystems. And for the regulation issues, to come up with a common regulation, I think we need more and a more precise definition of this close to nature forestry or low intervention forestry. It should be clearly linked to the different ecosystems. So we need to work on this on the beech forest, but I think similar things are needed to be done for other ecosystems. So as Zoltan already addressed, we need to protect the best we have, and we need close to nature forestry and the sustainable forestry on the rest of the area, not inside the protected area, but the buffer zones could be showcases how to do so. And we need result-based indicators and how to describe this integrity and the target state of the forest ecosystems. And we have some approaches through these FFH, Fauna Flora Habitat Directive, on the favorable state of conservation, but this is not harmonized even through Europe. Although we are dealing with the same beech forest ecosystems, there's still a lot of harmonization done. So breaking down these targets also from the biodiversity strategy in strict protected areas and other protected areas, these 10 and 30%, we need a good setup and defining the protection status and the rules and regulations. So protected area management has to deal with this, and we need good capacities in this World Heritage management, but in protected area management in general. And that's my colleague Michael Jungmeier is dealing with, and I want to hand over to his presentation.
Thank you very much, Hans. Thank you very much to all the colleagues who shared these exciting pieces of result of research with us in this morning session. And I want to come up with a concluding aspect, which is on how to translate all these scientific findings, all these scientific results into educational offers, into educational processes. I will share my screen with you. You should see it now. And you should also see now the presentation mode. I would like to share some of the thoughts that we have developed at this newly developed UNESCO chair for the management of conservation areas. It is very obvious that many things, for example, when you recall what Zoltan has shared with us on the policy levels, that many things will have to be implemented and adapted in the next years, and that we face many, many challenges. And in that context, the question of education is a very basic, a very elementary one. At the Carinthia University of Applied Sciences, we have developed a UNESCO chair for the management of conservation areas. I want to present our activities in a few slides, and then I have a very small video clip as well. We leave a little behind the world of the leaves, of the roots, of the plants, and we get a little bit in distance to our planet now with this famous picture. It's an iconic picture of the 20th century that was taken by Apollo 8 in the year 1968, when for the first time ever mankind was able to fly around the dark side of the moon. And when they visually reconnected to the Earth, they took this famous photograph. It was said, and this is also documented by many historical investigations, that this picture and the similar pictures had a very strong impact on the scientific world first, and later on the policy world, because it shows our planet as it is, a small, blue, tiny planet somewhere in a quite cold and not so friendly universe. And it was very clear, it became very clear to mankind that it makes sense to take care for this planet. And we will see on the next slide that immediately after these first Apollo photos were made and distributed, there was a significant effort in nature conservation. Many of these efforts connected to UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, as of course you know. And this UNESCO has launched a UNESCO Chair program, which is a network of, at the moment, some 800 scientific institutions linked to each other and being provided with the goal to work and to serve as think tanks and bridge builders between academia, civil society, local communities, research and policy making. This is the function of a UNESCO chair. You see on this slide that this photo of Earthrise as taken in the year 68, immediately after, sorry for that, immediately after, I'll share again. You see now the, oh, I just, give me 1 second, please. And I'll try again. Should work better now. That immediately after the first global initiatives towards nature conservation were taken, one of them, sorry for that, I'll keep it like it is. One of them was the Man and Biosphere Reserve, the Man and the Biosphere program, which later on resulted in the Man and Biosphere, in the Biosphere Reserve program. The Ramsar Convention in the year 71 was a milestone. It was the first nature conservation international convention or treaty, and many other conventions would follow, such as the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, which links me to the presentation of Hans. In this UNESCO world, as it is now, we have three significant categories of protected areas. One is the UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, being linked to the Man and the Biosphere program, where we have at the moment some 700 sites globally. We have the UNESCO World Heritage sites, some 200 of them being natural heritage sites. This means that this is sites of outstanding universal value as presented in the previous presentations. And amongst them, we also have 150 in about geoparks. So this is one, like a family, one cluster of protected areas that is globally established. The UNESCO chair, as it has been established at Carinthia University, has a mission. We have given a quite large promise to UNESCO. We have said that we want to do our best, really we want to do our best to empower and enable personality, institutions and societies to face the present and the future challenges in the management of conservation areas. And we want to use, and this is what you see on the next slide, we want to use the UNESCO sites as model regions where methods can be applied, where particular tools can be developed, and where these tools may be transferred to other categories of protected areas. All of the UNESCO sites are based on the international policies and standards and values as presented and represented by UNESCO. The activities of the chair are quite complex and have many different tasks. I want to highlight two of them because they would link us to the scholarly world and also to this seminar, to this very, very interesting conference. On one hand, we focus on formal educational offers, so on formal academic offers for managers and experts and representatives of protected areas or of conservation areas. And secondly, and this is indicated by the second blue arrow, we focus on research that is specifically addressed to new technologies. Which is specifically addressed to the interaction between man and the biosphere, and which is specifically addressed to methods and tools of citizen science. So this is the elements that we work with, and in this field we are looking for any cooperation that is feasible and that makes sense. So at the moment we're looking out for partners. What we can say in a very general way, it's that working for protected areas, working for conservation areas definitely means working for the most beautiful landscapes on the globe. Also, in many of your presentations, you referred to particular protected areas, national parks, nature parks, World Heritage Sites. This is reference sites that have significant importance for science and scientific activities. Of course, besides this beauty of the landscapes, which might be rather an emotional approach, we also need to say, and we need to consider, and we need to tell many people, in particular young people, that of course in this field there is many professional opportunities and offers. There is a tremendous claim and call for professional capacities to run these sites. We heard in previous presentations that in some 10, 15 years, 30% of the global surface shall be protected. But to manage 30% of the global surface, we will need strong institutions, effective institutions, and we will need highly qualified professionals to do so. To fill these capacities, we need also to consider, as I already said, that this demand is significantly, the demand for highly qualified people is significantly rising. This is the global surface of protected areas that you see indicated here in the slide. To be prepared for nature conservation in the 21st century, we have, as I said, developed in cooperation with many international institutions, not only in UNESCO, a Master of Science program, which is addressed to the management of conservation areas. This is a unique international learning experience for safeguarding biodiversity on one hand, and for supporting sustainable development on the other hand. Just a few technical facts, and then I will show this video clip, and I can keep the time frame and the time scheduled as it was provided for me. This Master of Science program is a full master program. It's a part-time study being conducted in 2 years only, so in a very condensed format. We have 4 terms, and we have 64 days of presence here in Austria. The next turn of this program will start in September 2021, and the deadline for application is quite close, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to present this specific information for you. Please help me to share. The deadline for application is January next year. I should be happy if we can stay in contact, and I will share a 2-minute video clip with you. And so far, I thank for your attention. The video clip will be there quite soon, I guess, at least.
There we go. I will share. You should see the screen right now. And we start. Is it okay?
The Carinthia University of Applied Sciences is the first University of Applied Sciences in Austria to receive a UNESCO chair for the Master of Science program, Management of Conservation Areas. The driving principle here is to do justice to education and research in the areas of the environment and sustainability.
Practically and technically, this means that this university is connected in many ways to the institutions of UNESCO, which is a global network with a lot of institutions, a lot of experiences, and also a lot of future jobs for our participants, not only at UNESCO, but in all these international institutions.
The 4-semester part-time master program has been designed for international students and those responsible for protected areas, such as national parks and biosphere parks. Prerequisites are good English skills, 3 years of relevant professional experience, and an academic degree.
The most important thing they need to bring with them, of course, is a really tough and strong motivation to go through this process, not only for getting enrolled and getting this study done, but also for being prepared for this future job, for this future profession.
The Carinthian Knock Mountains are the habitat for a large and diverse range of wildlife and plants. In order to preserve unique ecosystems like this one, scientific solutions to global challenges need to be researched and found.
Die einen wollen Erholung.
Some want rest. Farmers want financial revenues. Foresters want silence in forests, and visitors are disturbing hunters. Balancing all those different interests is the biggest challenge nowadays.
Die größte Herausforderung der jetzigen Zeit.
It is the question how to present a good visitor experience on one hand, and on the other hand to protect this biotop, this habitat.
This master's program provides those responsible for natural, national and biosphere parks the specialized and technical tools needed for their demanding work.
Ohne dieses fachliche
Without professional background knowledge, all those topics end up in extremely emotional discussions. In order to make them more objective, we definitely need scientific research and scientific insights.
Und die Erkenntnisse der Wissenschaft.
As the protected Earth surface increases, presently at 17%, the demand for natural resource managers who can plan, set up, and monitor these conservation areas is also increasing.
Today we had an opportunity to go to the Nockberge Biosphere Park to talk to the ranger and to understand how the things work here.
The view, the scenery and the culture that shaped this land is a part of this kind of a special park. And if you are going to be in the study program, you're learning how to manage this whole thing.
When they partner together, they can bring in ideas from different countries, and together we are stronger.
Graduates of the Master's Program Management of Conservation Areas with its UNESCO chair will ensure nature conservation in the 21st century and safeguard our environment for future generations. Be part of the new 4-semester part-time master program. Your career for our future.
So thank you very much. We're open for discussion and questions.
Thanks very much, Michael and Hans, for your contribution to the workshop on this topic of UNESCO, and especially on UNESCO beech forest. We it's very interesting to see there's still a lot to do in conservation science and planning science and our forest resources. And I would like to have your opinion on what would be the next challenges of having these very important reserves in our European territory. For example, tourism, it's a very great resource, but can be also at the same time like something to deal with, like as a threat. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think Zoltan mentioned already quite a lot of these challenges. One is the issue of the biofuels and bioenergies, which need to be addressed and based on scientific results and observations to point out that the forests have much more capacity to store carbon and fix carbon from the atmosphere. And this value is much higher than the contribution of replacing fossil energies, like we heard also in the first contribution of this workshop. So this is a huge pressure we should deal with, and the main challenge and pressure is for the forest ecosystem. It's not in the tourism, but in the exploitation of the forest, and reducing the exploitation down to a lower degree. Sultan mentioned 50%. I think this is really the main challenge of Europe and managing their forests. But not only Europe, but I think it's a global perspective, as if as one country or one protected area starts to reduce the harvesting of timber, there's a leakage. There might be a leakage effect that forest and timber from other areas would be used instead of these. So it really needs our common efforts on the global level to handle this need of timber and exploitation of timber in forests.
Thanks, Hans. I would also give a question to Michael, because he showed us the importance of education connected to UNESCO sites and reserves. What do you think that would be needed from a student that would be interested in conservation science to be focused on his formation?
For me, there is a astonishing mismatch between the findings of scientific world, the findings of the scholarly world, the political decision making, and the measures that really reach the ground. There is a significant gap, and we will need capacities to fill this gap. We need professional management skills. We need professional communication skills. We need people being capable to work with these new technologies wherever possible. And of course, we also need people who have a very good understanding of the economic mechanisms. And this is a challenging thing, because you need to know a little bit of many different disciplines and aspects. And as I tried to present also in this video clip, the students who want to work in this sector, they need to have a capacity to suffer a little bit on one hand, but also the capacity to have really a strong motivation, not only for themselves, but also to share with others.
Thanks, Michael. I guess that who pursue these targets in his life has to deal with a lot of several different topics, and must learn how to deal with science, technologies, but also economics and society and politics and laws. So it's really challenging, but also challenging study, but also great opportunities in the future to develop the field of conservation and forest conservation and nature conservation. So I leave the final remarks to the rector of our university, Stefano Ubertini, Professor Stefano Ubertini, who wants to say hello to everyone. Please, Stefano.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a few seconds. I will not give remarks. You are the experts, but I just wanted to welcome everybody at the University of Tuscia, although we are doing this only via web. I hope to welcome you very soon physically in Viterbo, so that you can visit our university, our medieval city of Viterbo, and our wonderful territory of Tuscia. I wish to thank you all for attending the workshop. I've seen that we had really several attendees, people from all over the world. Alfredo sent me a picture where I saw that we have people from Europe, South and North America, Asia, Africa and Oceania, so everywhere. This makes me very happy and very proud, and proves the great success of this initiative. And this is also a proof of the importance of the topic you have discussed today, the conservation and restoration of forests and grasslands, which on one side provide vital ecosystem services in support of several things like agriculture, food security, nutrition, and the other effect is the crucial contribution to climate change adaptation. Paying attention to this problem is of crucial importance for preserving and protecting the environment and really trying to make a change. We know about the environmental crisis since about 40, 50 years ago, but it wasn't done enough. And somehow also this pandemic has shown the severity of such a situation. And we need to face several environmental problems, and such problems must be solved with the help of scientists and experts. While instead there is a lot of confusion, many people talk about topics they don't know, and interventions are done not always coordinated enough and effective. And so I'm sure that discussions as this one, a project as the one you are carrying out together, and all the work done by scientists in this field will help a lot for addressing the environmental crisis. And finally, let me thank Alfredo Di Filippo and all the other colleagues for organizing the event and carrying out the research project. And I really thank a lot all the speakers for their presentation. I'm very sorry I couldn't hear the whole event, but I'm sure it was great. So thank you very much for coming online, and I'm waiting for you in presence at our university as soon as possible.
Thanks a lot, Stefano, the rector of our university, for his salutation for the workshop. We are very happy that he was able finally to be with us. And of course, the interaction, the multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity among many scientists and technicians will be the future for conserving nature, but also for developing a better world together. So there is a lot of still of opportunity to cooperate with on all the many aspects that we have discussed today. So I want to conclude just to repeat all our great thanks to the speakers that have spent their time with us together and providing their expertise in the different fields that we have discussed today. And also I want to say thanks to all the attendees for participating from all over the world. In the next weeks, we'll provide YouTube links on the channel of our university. We have an official channel for YouTube streaming, and we will try to put this day on the web for everyone. And so just a final remark to all the thanks for my department and the colleagues who has helped in organizing all these events. And So hope to organize other of these meetings in the future. It's not the same as being in person, but it's a great opportunity to find and meet people from all over the world. So thanks to everybody and see you to the next event. Have a good day.